Gideon Pierce straightened his lapels in the mirror, smiled at the man looking back at him, and then walked into the Sunday morning meeting with the quiet confidence of someone who had already decided how the day would end. He scanned the room until he found her, Vivian, seated alone in the back pew as always, her auburn hair catching the pale light, her hands folded in her lap like she was used to waiting for things that never came. He didn't approach her. He didn't need to. He simply leaned toward old Warren Holt near the door and said, just loud enough for the three people around them to hear, "Shame, isn't it? A woman that lovely. But what man wants a hollow tree?" He chuckled. Warren said nothing. Nobody ever said anything. And Vivian, 20 feet away, kept her eyes forward, because she had learned, the hard way, that turning around only gave them more to talk about. If this story already has your heart, you're in exactly the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what happens next. Because on this channel, every story cuts a little deeper than you expect. Give this one a like if Vivian deserves better than what this town gave her, and drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I read every single one, and I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because what Gideon Pierce set in motion that morning was about to collide with a man who didn't know the rules yet. The town of Harlan Crossing sat at the edge of a wide valley where the grass ran gold in October and the wind came down off the ridge like it had somewhere better to be. It wasn't a cruel town exactly. It was just a small one. And small towns had long memories and short patience for anything that complicated the stories they'd already told themselves. Vivian Ashcroft had been a complication for going on 4 years. She had arrived in Harlan Crossing as a bride, 22 years old and carrying nothing but a single trunk, and the particular kind of hope that only survives in people who haven't been beaten down enough times yet. Gideon Pierce had been 40, well-established, respected by every man in the valley who owned land or wanted to. He had a good jaw and a firm handshake, and a way of entering a room that made other men straighten up without quite knowing why. The marriage had lasted 3 years. There were no children. That was the whole of the story, as far as Harlan Crossing was concerned. Gideon had not made a scene when he ended the marriage. He was too composed for scenes. He had simply, over the course of several months, begun letting certain things slip in certain conversations. A sigh here. A carefully placed silence there. The way he'd say, "Vivian is a fine woman. I mean that," in a tone that turned fine into something a man said about a horse that couldn't work anymore. He never said the word Barren in public. He didn't have to. That word traveled on its own once you gave it the right nudge. By the time Vivian moved into the small house on the east side of town, the one with the warped front step and the window that didn't close all the way, the story had already finished writing itself. Barren. That was what people knew about her. Not that she had kept that marriage running almost entirely on her own effort. Not that she had repaired fences and managed household accounts, and learned to stretch 3 days of food into 5 when Gideon's cattle deals went sideways. Not any of that, just the one word. And so she sat in the back pew every Sunday, and nobody sat beside her. Cole Brennan rode into Harlan Crossing on a Thursday in late September, which meant he had exactly 1 week before the first real cold came rolling down from the ridge. He didn't know that yet. He was still learning what this valley did to a man if he wasn't prepared for it. He was 34 years old, lean in the way that came from working rather than from not eating, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that had spent enough time in the weather to have earned a few lines around the eyes. He had bought the old Mercer Place site mostly unseen. He'd ridden out once in summer, looked at the land, decided the price was fair, and signed the papers before anyone in town could tell him why the Mercer Place had changed hands twice in 6 years. He found out why on his first full day there. The main house had a roof that leaked in 2 places. The barn needed at least 3 new boards on the south wall, or the first hard wind was going to make that decision for him. There were 4 ranch hands who had been left behind by the previous owner's hasty departure. Men who were competent enough, but who had clearly been operating without anyone giving much direction for months, because the supply shed looked like it had been organized by a man working in the dark, and the kitchen was in a state that Cole didn't have the vocabulary to properly describe. He stood in the middle of that kitchen on his first morning and said, to no one in particular, "Well." That was all he said. Then he went to work. He spent that first week doing the kind of triage that comes before actual repair, figuring out which problems were urgent and which ones were merely bad. The roof was urgent. The barn wall was urgent. The supply situation was urgent. The kitchen, he decided, was a problem he didn't have the skill set to solve on his own, and he wasn't too proud to admit it. Hank Delroy, his most experienced hand, a weathered man in his 50s who communicated primarily through expressions rather than words, watched Cole take inventory of the kitchen disaster on the fourth day and said, almost kindly, "Previous fella didn't cook much." "What did he do?" "Paid for meals in town." Cole looked at the four men who depended on this operation running and said, "We can't afford to do that." Hank scratched the back of his neck. "I know a woman who could help. She's good. Better than good, if I'm being straight with you. But the town's got opinions about her." "The town have opinions about whether she can cook and manage a household?" "No," Hank said. "On those particular matters, the town would not argue with you." "Then I don't need the town's opinions," Cole said. "What's her name?" It's..." He found her on a Saturday morning. She was in the small yard behind her East Side house, hanging laundry with the focused efficiency of someone who had long since stopped caring whether anyone watched. The morning was cold enough that her breath came out in small clouds. She was wearing a dark blue dress and a canvas apron, and her auburn hair was pinned up in a practical way, not a decorative one. Cole stopped at the fence. He didn't know exactly what he'd expected, something more defeated maybe. The town had painted him a picture of a broken woman. What he saw was someone who was moving through her morning with the calm competence of a person who had made her peace with being underestimated. "Mrs. Ashcroft?" She turned, looked at him with those green eyes that were quieter than he expected, more measuring. "Yes. My name's Cole Brennan. I bought the old Mercer place." "I heard." She didn't say it with warmth or coldness, just fact. "I need someone who can manage the household there. Cooking, organizing, general order. Hank Delroy suggested you. I'm offering fair wages, and you'd have your own space in the house, separate from the men's quarters." She was quiet for a moment. She turned back to the laundry, pulled a shirt from the basket, and pinned it to the line before she said anything. "Did Hank tell you why I'm available for work like that instead of something else?" "He told me the town has opinions. That's a gentle way of putting it." "I'm not hiring the town's opinions," Cole said. "I'm hiring someone who can turn a chaotic house into a working one before winter hits. Hank says you can do that. Can you?" She turned around and looked at him again. Really looked, the way people do when they're trying to figure out whether someone is lying or just careless with the truth. "Yes," she said. "I can do that." "Then we have an arrangement." She nodded once. "I can start Monday." Cole put his hat back on. "I'll have Hank show you around when you arrive." He paused. "I don't need anything from you except the work. And I don't bring other people's business into my house." He was halfway to his horse when she said, "Mr. Brennan." He turned. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, somewhere between gratitude and warning. "The town will talk." "The town can do whatever it needs to do," he said. "Monday morning, then." She arrived at the Mercer place. She still thought of it as the Mercer place, couldn't make herself call it the Brennan Ranch yet. At first light on Monday with a single bag of her own supplies, because she had learned not to assume anyone else's kitchen would have what she needed. What she found was worse than she'd imagined, and better than it had any right to be. The house was structurally sound underneath its disorder. She could see that within the first 10 minutes of walking through it. The bones were good. Someone had built it to last. It had just been neglected by people who didn't care about it. The kitchen had a proper stove, which was more than she'd sometimes had. The pantry had some supplies, wrong things in wrong quantities, but that was fixable. The main problem wasn't what was missing, it was the complete absence of any system. She stood in the middle of the kitchen with her hands on her hips and thought, all right, start with what you can touch first. She started with the stove. By the time Cole came in from the barn at 6:30, there was coffee on and bread that was 40 minutes from being done, and she had already reorganized the dry goods into an order that made sense. He stood in the kitchen doorway and just looked at the space like he was confirming it was the same room he'd left. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "Since 5. He poured himself coffee. She noticed he poured it without being invited, which meant he was comfortable in spaces, which was useful information, and said, "You don't have to start before sunrise." "The bread does," she said, "which means I do." He drank the coffee and didn't argue the point, which she respected. The ranch hands were another matter. There were 4 of them. Hank, who she already knew was solid. A young man named Dusty, who was 18 and eager and broke things without meaning to. An older, quiet man named Abe, who she suspected was more skilled than he let on. And a fourth, Reuben, who looked at her arrival with the flat skepticism of a man who had been burned before and had decided everyone was suspect until proven otherwise. Reuben made his position clear at breakfast on the first morning. He came in from the barn, saw the changed kitchen, saw Vivian at the stove, and said to Hank, not to her, "How long is she staying?" Hank glanced at Vivian, who kept her back to the room and kept turning the bacon. "Long as she wants, I'd expect," Hank said. Reuben made a sound in his throat. Then he said, still not to her, "Town's going to have things to say about a woman living out here with a crew of men." Vivian set the spoon down, turned around slowly, looked directly at Reuben, who had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "The town," she said with great evenness, "already has things to say about me. I've been surviving that for 4 years. If that's the worst you can offer as a reason for why I shouldn't be here, you'll have to try again." Silence. Dusty, who was sitting at the table already, stared at his plate like it was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. Reuben looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down and said nothing more about it. She turned back to the stove. That, she thought, is how you do that. The thing about competence is that it doesn't announce itself. It just appears over and over until the people around it stop having any argument left. By the end of the first week at the Brennan Ranch, the kitchen ran on a schedule that every man on the property had adjusted himself to without being told to. Breakfast at 6, dinner at noon, supper at 6 in the evening. Hot food, substantial food, not fancy, not elaborate, but the kind of cooking that made a man feel like his body had gotten what it actually needed. She found Abe's hidden skill set on Wednesday when she noticed the way he looked at the torn seams on Dusty's work shirt. She handed him a needle and thread without comment, and he spent the whole evening at the kitchen table repairing 3 shirts without a word of objection. And after that, they had an arrangement where she handled the cooking and the organization, and he handled the mending, and neither of them mentioned it to anyone as if it required explanation. She fixed the supply system on Thursday, went through everything in the pantry and the shed, and wrote out in careful handwriting exactly what needed to be ordered and in what quantities and by when, and handed the list to Cole without ceremony. He looked it over for a minute. Then he looked up. "This is for 6 weeks out." "Winter comes when it wants to," she said. "Not when we're ready." He nodded slowly. "This is more thorough than anything the last 2 operations put together ever managed. I've had practice running a household with less than I should have had," she said. Not bitter, just matter of fact. Something shifted in his expression, not pity. She would have shut down at pity. Something more like recognition, like he'd heard what she wasn't saying and filed it away carefully. "I'll get this ordered by end of week," he said. "What?" On Sunday, she went to meeting as she always did. She put on her good dress, the green one that matched her eyes, even though she tried not to think about things like that anymore. And she walked the 2 miles into town because she did not have a horse, and she would not ask to borrow one. She walked with her shoulders straight and her face composed, the way she had taught herself to walk after the first few months of being someone the town talked about. She sat in the back pew. The room filled around her the way water fills every space except the one you're standing in. She was used to it. That was the particular cruelty of it. She was so used to it that it had stopped hurting in the sharp way and had settled into something more like a dull, permanent weight. Like a stone she'd swallowed so long ago, she'd stopped remembering it wasn't supposed to be there. She opened her book and kept her eyes on it while people found seats every place in the room except beside her. Then she heard boots on the wood floor, different from the usual shuffle. Someone walking with direction. She looked up. Cole Brennan was standing at the end of her pew, hat in his hand, looking at her with that same direct, uncomplicated expression he'd had when he'd offered her the job. Like he'd assessed the situation and made his decision and saw no reason to perform uncertainty about it. "May I sit with you?" he asked. The room went very quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of people listening to what they were supposed to listen to. The other kind. The deliberate kind, where everyone is very carefully not looking at the thing they are absolutely looking at. Vivian felt her throat tighten. Not from emotion exactly. More from the particular vertigo of having something unexpected happen in a space where you had trained yourself to expect nothing. "Of course," she said. He sat down beside her, just like that. He opened his own worn book. She noticed it was well used, the spine cracked in the way that meant he'd actually read it, not just owned it, and he sat there the same way she sat there, quietly, composedly, without performing anything for the room. Behind her, she heard a whisper. She couldn't catch the words, but she didn't need to. She knew the shape of those whispers. She'd been hearing them for 4 years. Cole did not appear to hear them, or if he did, he demonstrated no interest in responding to them. The meeting started. She kept her eyes forward. Beside her, he turned pages when she did, not ahead, not behind. Afterward, when people filed out, Margaret Holt, Warren's wife, one of the town's most efficient conductors of information, appeared at the end of the pew with the expression of someone who had appointed herself to a task. "Mr. Brennan," she said with a smile that had work inside it, "I see you've found a seat." "I have," Cole said pleasantly. "I only mention it because—" Margaret glanced at Vivian, not unkindly but not kindly either, more like acknowledging a weather condition. "There are folks in this town who might have useful information for a new arrival. About the valley. About the people in it." "I appreciate that," Cole said, "though I find I learn most of what I need to know by watching how people treat each other." Margaret's smile went very still. "Good morning, Mrs. Holt," Vivian said quietly. Margaret looked at her. Something moved behind her eyes that Vivian couldn't quite identify. Then Margaret nodded, just once, and moved away. Cole watched her go. Then he said to Vivian, without turning it into anything more than it was, "Is she always like that?" "Usually worse," Vivian said. He almost smiled. "All right, I'll adjust my expectations." They walked out of the meeting hall into the bright October morning, and Vivian was acutely aware of the eyes on them, the recalibration happening in real time as people processed the information that Cole Brennan had sat beside the Ashcroft widow deliberately and spoken to her afterward in broad daylight without apparent regret. She thought, he has no idea what he just did to his standing in this town. She thought, I should tell him. Then she thought, he's not a child. He can see them watching. She said nothing. He walked with her as far as the road that split, one way into town, one way back toward the valley, and then he said, "I'll see you tomorrow morning, Mrs. Ashcroft," and went to get his horse, and she walked home with the feeling of a woman who has been carrying a very heavy thing alone for a long time, and has just, for a few minutes, had someone walk beside her and not treat it like a burden they were performing the good virtue of tolerating. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was too close to something she'd stopped letting herself want. The talk started before she was halfway home. She didn't hear it, not directly, not yet, but she felt it the way you feel weather changing, the slight shift in how people looked away when she passed, the particular silence of a town that is rearranging its narrative. By Tuesday morning, it had reached the ranch. Reuben came in from town after riding for supplies, and he set the goods down on the kitchen table with more force than necessary, and he said to the room at large, she was right there, she was slicing bread. He was not trying to be subtle. Town says the new rancher's made himself a project out of the widow. Vivian kept slicing. Dusty looked up from the corner where he'd been fixing a bridle. What town says and what's true aren't always the same thing. Well, Reuben said, town says what it says. Reuben. This was Hank from the doorway, in the flat voice he used when he'd decided something was done. Eat your breakfast. Reuben sat down. But the words were in the room now, and everyone felt them. Vivian set the bread on the table, poured coffee for the men as she always did, and then she went back to the stove and she thought, here we go, here's where it starts again. She knew this pattern. She'd lived through it once already. The rumors starting slow and gathering weight, like snow accumulating on a branch until the branch decided it was finally done. The question was what Cole would do when the weight got heavy enough. She had thought, once, briefly, after the Sunday meeting, that maybe he was genuinely different, that maybe the simple fact of him sitting beside her without rehearsing it meant something real. But she had thought things like that before. She told herself, don't assume. Watch what he does when it costs him something. That's the only honest test. Woke. The cost arrived on Wednesday. Tom Garrett was one of the 3 men in the valley who controlled the main supply route that the smaller ranches depended on. He wasn't cruel. He was transactional, which was in some ways worse because it meant his objections were always couched in business logic rather than personal feeling, which made them harder to argue with. He came to the Brennan ranch at midday on Wednesday, and he found Cole in the barn working on a harness, and he sat down on a hay bale, and he talked for about 10 minutes about the importance of reputation in a small valley and the way business relationships depended on trust, and how trust was built on the foundation of shared understanding of the community's values. Vivian was in the barn because she had come to get Abe to help move a shelf unit in the supply shed, and she had stopped when she heard Tom Garrett's voice, and she had stayed still in the shadow near the door because she was not proud of it, but she needed to hear this. "I'll be straight with you, Brennan, since you're new," Tom said. "The woman you've hired, people in this valley have concerns, not about her work, about what having her at your place says about your judgment." Cole kept working on the harness. He didn't stop. "What does it say about my judgment?" "That you don't know the situation." "Tell me the situation." Tom paused. "She was married to Gideon Pierce. You know who Pierce is, runs the Western grazing operations. During that marriage, it came to light that she couldn't," he cleared his throat, "that there were no children and no prospects of any. Pierce is a reasonable man. He needed a family to carry on the operation. It was a sad circumstance, but an understandable one." "And," Cole said, "and a man who doesn't understand why Pierce made the choices he did might find himself misaligned with how business is done in this valley." The harness work had stopped. Vivian held her breath. "Let me make sure I understand you," Cole said, and his voice had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that had weight in it. "You're telling me that I should factor Gideon Pierce's opinion of my household arrangements into my business decisions. I'm telling you that Pierce has relationships with most of the supply operations in this valley, and I'm telling you that what happens on my property is my business, and who works on my property is my business, and if Pierce has concerns about that, he can ride out and raise them with me himself." Cole picked up the harness again. "I appreciate you being straight with me, Tom. Now I'm being straight with you. Is there anything else?" Tom Garrett sat on the hay bale for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he stood up. "Your choice," he said. "It is," Cole agreed. Tom left. Vivian stayed in the shadow for another full minute after the sound of his horse had faded. She was trying to identify the thing she was feeling. It wasn't relief exactly. Relief was too simple. It was more complicated, more fragile. "Don't build on this," she told herself. "One conversation doesn't make a man." But she walked back to the house with something she hadn't had in a long time. Something that felt, carefully and tentatively, like the early warning signs of hope. She told herself to be careful with it. She had learned, at significant cost, that hope was not a thing you could put down once you'd picked it up. It changed everything it touched, and if it turned out to be wrong, it left the kind of damage that took years to repair. She was not ready to be damaged like that again. But she did not put it down. She carried it back to the kitchen, and she got on with making supper, and she did not let herself think about Gideon Pierce, or Tom Garrett, or Margaret Holt, or any of the machinery that was now turning against the small thing that had barely started. She just cooked. She set the table. She called the men when the food was ready. And when Cole came in from the barn and sat down to eat, she said nothing about what she had heard, and he said nothing about it either, and they ate supper in the kitchen of a house that was slowly, imperfectly, beginning to feel like something worth fighting for. The cold came down from the ridge on Thursday night and didn't apologize for it. Vivian felt it before she heard it, a shift in the air around 3 in the morning that woke her, the way certain kinds of silence do, the kind that means something has changed and your body knew it before your mind caught up. She lay still for a moment, listening to the wind find the gaps in the house, and then she got up and put more wood on the fire in the kitchen, because that was what you did when you were a woman who understood that warmth didn't maintain itself. She was at the stove by 4:30, earlier than usual, because something in the changed weather told her the men were going to need a proper breakfast before they went out into it. Cole came in at 5:15, earlier than she expected, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw her already at work, the same way he'd stopped that first morning, like he was still occasionally surprised to find the house functioning the way he'd hoped, but hadn't quite counted on. "Frost," he said. "I know. I felt it." He poured his coffee and stood near the stove, not crowding her, just close enough to share the warmth. He looked tired in a way that suggested he hadn't slept well either. "The south water trough is going to freeze by mid-morning if this keeps up," he said. "I need to get Abe and Dusty on that before they start anything else. I'll have food on the table in 20 minutes. He nodded. Then, instead of leaving to get the men, he stayed where he was, turning the coffee cup in both hands, and said, "Tom Garrett came back." She turned from the stove. "When?" "Yesterday evening, late, after supper." He looked at her steadily. He wasn't alone this time. She waited. "Pierce sent a man with him, fellow named Coates. Runs errands for Pierce, from what I can tell. Coates didn't say much. Tom did most of the talking. Same direction as before, just with more behind it." Cole set the cup down. "They're suggesting I buy my winter feed from a supplier 2 valleys over instead of through the local arrangement, if I want to keep current arrangements in place." Vivian turned fully away from the stove. "They're cutting your supply access. They're threatening to. There's a difference. Not much of one, come January." "No," he said, "not much of one." She looked at him for a moment. His face was the kind of tired that had thinking behind it, not defeat. She had learned to read the difference in people. The tired that meant they were working on a problem versus the tired that meant they'd decided the problem had won. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I've already written to a man in Carlisle about feed supply. He's not local, but he's reliable and his prices are fair. I'll know by next week if the arrangement works." He picked up the coffee again. "What I want to know is how long this has been going on. Pierce using his connections to squeeze people." "Long enough that most of the valley doesn't think of it as squeezing anymore," she said. "They think of it as the way things are." "How long did he do it to you?" She went very still. It wasn't the question itself, it was the directness of it. Most people in Harlan Crossing approached the subject of Gideon Pierce and Vivian Ashcroft the way you approached a beehive, with great caution and from a distance. "He didn't need to do it to me," she said finally. "I didn't have anything he needed to take. By the time he was done with the marriage, I had the house on the east side and a reputation that made sure I stayed small enough not to matter." Cole looked at her. "And did that work? Did you stay small?" She thought about the supply list she'd written out, the kitchen she'd reorganized from disorder into function, the way the 4 men on this property had adjusted themselves to a system she'd built in less than a week. "Apparently not," she said. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but the shape that a smile left behind. "No," he said. "Apparently not." The men came in for breakfast, and the conversation ended there, but Vivian carried it with her through the morning like a coal carried in cupped hands, carefully, aware that it was warm, aware that it could burn. Bob. By the end of October, the Brennan Ranch had become a different kind of problem for Harlan Crossing. The original problem had been simple: a disreputable woman employed in close quarters with a crew of unmarried men, which gave the town a convenient moral framework to hang its objections on. But the ranch was visibly running better. Anyone who drove past could see it: the barn repairs done clean and solid, the yard in order, smoke coming from the chimney at reasonable hours. Dusty had stopped looking like a boy playing at ranch work and started looking like someone who understood what he was doing. Even Reuben, whose skepticism about Vivian had been professional grade on arrival, had gone noticeably quiet on the subject in a way that meant he'd revised his position but wasn't going to say so out loud. The town's problem was that there was nothing specific to point at anymore. Just a woman doing work, doing it well, and a man who had the annoying habit of not caring what people said about it. So the town did what small towns do when the specific complaints run out. It went for the general. Vivian felt the shift the second week of November when she went into Garvey's dry goods store to pick up a few items, and Dorothy Garvey, who had always been stiffly polite in the way of a woman who had decided to be civil without being warm, looked up from behind the counter and said, not unkindly but with a precision that made kindness irrelevant, "I hear you're practically running the Brennan place now." "I work there," Vivian said. "Same as I have been." "Living there," Dorothy said. "Full time." "I have my own room. I had my own room from the first week." "Of course you do," Dorothy said, and the way she said it made the words mean their exact opposite. Vivian bought what she needed and left. She walked the 2 miles back to the ranch in the cold with the particular inner tightness of a woman who is accustomed to being insulted at a level too refined for direct confrontation. The kind of insult that, if you called it what it was, made you look like the one being unreasonable. She had gotten good at walking away from those. She had not gotten comfortable with it. When she got back to the ranch, Cole was in the yard talking to a man she didn't recognize. The stranger was well dressed in the particular way of men who made their money from other people's work. Clean coat, good boots, hands that hadn't seen a season of outdoor labor in years. He was probably 50, with silver at his temples and a way of standing that reminded her with a cold precision of Gideon Pierce. It was not Gideon Pierce, but it was the same category of man. Cole saw her arrive and he said, "Mrs. Ashcroft," with deliberate plainness, the way you introduce someone in public when you want to make clear that the person exists and is real and has a name. "This is Mr. Aldrich. He runs the Cattlemen's Exchange in town." "I know who Mr. Aldrich is," Vivian said. Aldrich turned and looked at her the same way Dorothy Garvey had, with the expression of someone who has already made a judgment and is merely confirming it. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, with a small nod that was technically polite and functionally dismissive. "I was just explaining to Mr. Brennan," Aldrich said, turning back to Cole as though Vivian had stopped existing, "that the exchange has certain membership requirements, standards, you might say, of professional standing. New operations are reviewed based on the reputation of the principal parties." "I see," Cole said. "The exchange facilitates a great deal of valley commerce, cattle pricing, grazing agreements, shared resources. Being outside the exchange can make operations of your size quite difficult. And the exchange is concerned about my operation's reputation," Cole said. "Let's say the exchange has received questions," Aldrich said carefully, "about the nature of certain arrangements." Cole looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Vivian, actually looked at her, acknowledged her presence in the middle of a conversation that was entirely about her, and said, "Mrs. Ashcroft manages my household. She has her own room, she works fair hours, she receives fair wages. She's not the first woman to hold a housekeeper's position on a ranch in this valley, and I'd be curious to know which of the exchange's members would like to explain the difference between her situation and any of the others." Aldrich's mouth tightened. "It's the history," he said, with the precision of a man choosing weapons carefully. "Whose history?" Cole said. "Because the history I'm aware of is a woman who ran a household competently for several years and then got told a story about herself by the man who had the most to gain from it." Aldrich went very still. "Gideon Pierce," Cole said, "is a member of your exchange. I'm not yet. If the membership requirements include deferring to Pierce's account of his own former wife, I'll save us both some time and say that won't be a requirement I'll be meeting." The silence in the yard was the kind that had edges. Aldrich looked at Vivian again. This time it wasn't dismissal. It was something more complicated, recalculation maybe, or the early stages of it. "I'll relay your position to the board," he said. "You do that," Cole said pleasantly. Aldrich got on his horse and left. Vivian stood in the yard until the sound of hoofbeats was gone. Her hands were folded in front of her and she was working very hard to keep her face composed, because what she was feeling was not composed. It was something fiercer than that, something she hadn't had much practice managing, because for 4 years there had been nothing to feel fierce about on her own behalf. "You just cost yourself the exchange membership," she said. "Maybe," Cole said. "Not maybe. Aldrich goes back to Pierce with what you just said, and you'll be outside the exchange for as long as Pierce has a hand in it." "Probably true." She looked at him. "That's going to make your winter harder." "The Carlisle supplier came through on feed," Cole said. "And I've been talking to 2 other ranchers in the eastern part of the valley who have their own issues with Pierce. If what I think is true, that Pierce has been running this kind of pressure on multiple operations, not just mine, there might be a way around the exchange entirely." She stared at him. "You've been building alternative connections." "I've been having conversations," he said carefully. "I learned the hard way in my last county that when one man controls too much of the infrastructure, you either play by his rules or you build a second road. Building takes longer, but you own it when you're done." Vivian was quiet for a moment. She thought about 4 years of owning nothing and having no second road. The East Side house with its warped step. The careful management of reputation by a man who had decided that managing hers served his interests. The Sunday meetings and the empty pew space, and the way Dorothy Garvey said, "Of course you do," and meant something that could never be argued with directly. "He did the same thing to me," she said. "Just smaller, because I was smaller." Cole looked at her steadily. "I know." "Does it make you angry?" she asked. "That you're in this position because of me?" "I'm in this position," he said, "because Gideon Pierce is the kind of man who uses his connections to hurt people who don't deserve it." That's not a position caused by you. It's a position caused by him. She looked away, down toward the barn where she could hear Abe and Dusty working, the sound of hammering, something being fixed. You're going to keep running into this, she said quietly. Every time Pierce decides to remind the valley that you chose not to play along. Probably, Cole said. Does that change how well you do your job? She looked back at him. No? Then it doesn't change anything I care about right now, he said. Come inside, it's getting cold. She followed him into the house and she told herself, don't make this into more than it is. He's a pragmatic man defending his operation. That's all this is. But she was not entirely sure she believed that anymore. Well, Gideon Pierce came to the ranch on a Tuesday in the second week of November. Vivian saw him from the kitchen window. She recognized his horse first, a tall, dark roan that he'd always ridden because the height made him visible from a distance, which he preferred. Then she recognized the way he sat in the saddle, that particular combination of ease and deliberateness that she had once found reassuring and now recognized as performance. He tied the horse at the post and walked to the front door with the comfort of a man who had never in his life considered that he might not be welcome somewhere. She heard Cole answer the door. She stayed in the kitchen. She did not go out. She was not going to perform the scene that Gideon was almost certainly hoping for, some version where she flinched, or where she presented herself in a way that confirmed whatever story he'd come here to tell. She could hear their voices, but not the words, the low register of men talking on a porch. Cole's voice was even. Gideon's had that particular cadence she knew well, the one that said, I'm being reasonable, I'm being generous, I'm giving you an opportunity here in a tone designed to make it hard to say no without looking like you were the unreasonable one. After about 12 minutes, the voices stopped. She heard the front door close. Cole came into the kitchen. He looked at her and she looked at him and she said, What did he say? He came in to offer me a deal. Cole sat down at the kitchen table, which he did sometimes when he was thinking through something. Full exchange membership, supply access through the Valley Network, introduction to 3 major cattle buyers he works with. He folded his hands on the table. In exchange for terminating your employment. The room went very quiet. Vivian had known, on some level, that this was coming. She had known it the way you know a storm is coming when the air changes. Not because you can see it yet, but because everything your body knows about weather is telling you. And still, hearing it said plainly made something cold settle in her chest. And what did you tell him? She said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. She was grateful for that. I told him no. She looked at him. Cole, I told him no, he said again, with a quiet finality that didn't have anger in it, just certainty. What he's offering isn't a deal. It's a test of whether I'll do what he says when he asks me to, and if I do it once, he'll ask again. That's how this kind of arrangement works. You'd be better positioned for spring, the exchange connections. I'd be positioned as a man Pierce can move, he said. That's not a position I'm interested in. He looked at her directly. And I'm not interested in what it says about how I run my operation, or what it says to you. She sat down across from him at the table. Her hands were in her lap and she was working to keep them still. This is going to get worse, she said. He's not going to stop. No, Cole said. He's not. Then what do you do? He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved across the yard and she could hear it finding the places in the house that weren't fully sealed yet. The high, thin whistle of air through a gap, something she'd been meaning to mention to Abe. I keep working, Cole said, and I stop making decisions based on what he might do next. He looked at her. What did you do? For 4 years in that house with the bad window, in that back pew every Sunday, what did you do? She thought about it honestly. I got smaller, she said, for a while, and then I decided that was worse than just taking the hits. So I stopped trying to avoid it and just, she paused, just lived, made things work where I could, did the job in front of me. That's what I'm doing, Cole said. She looked at him for a moment. This man who had sat beside her in a back pew when every seat in the room was empty, who had told Tom Garrett and Aldrich and now Gideon Pierce himself that his household was his business, and he didn't intend to run it by committee. He's going to come after the Eastern Valley contacts, she said. If he finds out you're building an alternative supply network, he'll pressure those ranchers the same way he's pressuring you. Cole's expression shifted. You know who he's done this to before. I know this valley, she said. I've lived in it for 7 years, 4 of them invisible enough that people said things around me they would have said differently if they'd thought I was listening. Yes, I know which operations Pierce has squeezed, and I know roughly how. She looked at him steadily. If you want to build something that holds, you need to know where the pressure points are before he uses them. Cole looked at her for a long moment. She could see him recalibrating, not his trust of her exactly, but the scope of what she was offering. Would you tell me? He said. I'll tell you everything I know, she said. But I want you to understand what it means if I do. Right now, Pierce is annoyed. If you start building a real network, one that actually threatens the exchange's hold, he won't be annoyed anymore. I understand that. I don't think you do yet, she said, not unkindly. You haven't seen him when he's decided someone is an actual problem, rather than a minor inconvenience. I have. It's different. She was not trying to frighten him. She was trying to be accurate, which was different. She had spent too long around people who managed information strategically, including information about her own situation, to be comfortable with anything that wasn't plain. Cole looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that meant he'd heard not just the surface of what she'd said, but the shape underneath it. You're warning me, he said, not to protect yourself, because you think I should actually know what I'm walking into. Yes, she said simply. All right. He held her gaze. Tell me. She took a breath, and then she began to talk, carefully, in order, the way she'd learned to organize information in the years when organizing things was the only power she'd had. She told him about the Hartley operation on the north side of the valley, which Pierce had systematically cut off from buyers 3 years ago after Hartley refused to sell his water rights. About the small rancher named Baines who had tried to start an independent trading arrangement and had found his cattle repeatedly turned away from market on technicalities until he gave up. About the way Pierce structured his exchange membership requirements so that the most valuable benefits were always just out of reach for anyone who hadn't been there long enough, which made new arrivals dependent on Pierce's goodwill in their first winters, the most vulnerable season, which was not an accident. Cole listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both specific, both about things she'd touched on briefly. She gave him the detail she had. When she was done, the kitchen was fully dark outside the windows, and she realized they'd been talking for nearly 2 hours, and the supper she'd been planning had not been made. I should start food, she said. In a minute. Cole was looking at the table as though there were something on it he was reading. The Hartley and Baines situations. Are those men still in the valley? Hartley sold and left. Baines is still there, but he's operating at a fraction of what he was. Would he talk to me? She considered. If you approached him right. He's been burned once, and he's cautious. What's the right approach? Don't lead with what you want from him, she said. Lead with what Pierce did to you. Let him see you understand it from the inside. Then ask if he wants company. Cole looked up at her. Something in his expression was very quiet and very focused. You've been thinking about this, he said. I've had 4 years and very little to do with the evenings except think, she said. There was something dry in it, not bitter exactly, just the particular humor of a woman who had converted a lot of misery into understanding. He almost smiled. We'll start supper in a minute, but I want to say something first. She waited. What Pierce did to you, labeling you, managing your reputation, using the valley's connections to keep you small, that wasn't because you were small. It was because he was afraid of what you were without his name attached to you. Cole said it plainly, not dramatically, the way he said most things. I've been watching you run this house for 6 weeks. I know what you're capable of. He knew it too. That's why he had to neutralize you first. The room was very quiet. Vivian looked at the table. She was doing the internal work of receiving something without flinching away from it, which she had gotten out of the habit of doing. You don't have to say that, she said. I know I don't have to, he said. I said it because it's true, and you ought to have heard it from someone by now. She looked up at him. There were things she could have said, a lot of them. Careful, measured, appropriately distanced things that would have kept the moment from being what it was. 2 people sitting across a table in a cold kitchen, saying true things to each other in the dark. She said none of them. Thank you, she said instead. It was not elegant. It was not everything the moment deserved. But it was honest, and honest had become the currency she trusted most. Cole nodded once. Then he stood up and said, I'll get Abe and Dusty. Tell me what you need from the cold store. They made supper together, working around each other in the kitchen with the ease of people who had been doing it long enough to stop narrating the process. And if anything had shifted between them, it didn't announce itself. It just sat quietly in the room alongside everything else, patient, not pushing, waiting to see what would happen next. The next Sunday, Cole sat beside her in the back pew again, and the Sunday after that. By the third Sunday, the room had stopped going quite so quiet when he did it. Not because they'd accepted it, Harlan Crossing was not a town that accepted things quickly, but because they'd run out of the kind of stunned silence that required something to still be surprising. It had become a fact, the way weather becomes a fact. Not liked, not approved of, but present in a way that argued with denial. Margaret Holt had taken to watching them with an expression that had evolved from sharp attention into something more complicated. Vivian noticed this without attaching too much meaning to it. Margaret was a woman who ran on information the way other people ran on food, and the information she was getting from watching Cole and Vivian together was apparently generating more questions than it was answering, which Margaret found uncomfortable. Dorothy Garvey still said, of course, in the voice that meant its opposite. But something was moving. Slowly, unevenly, the way things move in small towns, not dramatically, not cleanly, but present in the small adjustments. The way two women at the dry goods counter stopped talking when Vivian entered, which meant they had been talking about her, but also moved a half step toward her before they stopped themselves, which meant some part of what they were saying was working in her direction rather than against it. She did not count this as victory. She had been careful about declaring things victory before they were. She had learned that from a very thorough lesson, delivered over 3 years by a man who was very good at making things look like progress until they weren't. The letter came on a Wednesday at the end of November. It was addressed to Vivian, not to Cole, not to the ranch in general, but specifically to her, in handwriting she recognized before she even fully registered what she was seeing. Gideon. She stood in the yard with the letter in her hand, and she did not open it immediately. She turned it over, looked at her own name in his writing, and felt the old familiar pressure behind her sternum that she had not felt in months. The one that came from being reminded that the past was not as far away as she had managed to make it feel. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table, alone, the house quiet around her because Cole was in the barn and the hands were out with the cattle. She opened the letter. It was short. 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph was concerned in the particular way Gideon was always concerned, as a way of establishing that he was the reasonable party, that whatever came next was being offered in a spirit of genuine care. He was writing to let her know that her continued presence at the Brennan ranch was causing him some personal pain, that he felt responsible, as her former husband, for the way her reputation had suffered, that he had been making efforts, this was the word he used, efforts, to correct certain impressions, and those efforts were complicated by her current situation. The second paragraph said that he was prepared to offer her a position. Bookkeeping. Real wages. A situation with his own household operations that would give her the kind of respectable standing she deserved. He signed it. With continued regard, Gideon. She read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in her hands and sat with the reality of what it was, which was not a letter of concern. It was a repositioning move. If she went back into his orbit, any orbit, he could control the narrative again. He could be the generous former husband who had found a good situation for his troubled ex-wife. He could use her proximity to manage what the Valley thought about her, which was really what he cared about, because what the Valley thought about her was connected to what it thought about him, which was the only thing that had ever genuinely mattered to Gideon Pierce. She set the letter on the table. She thought about the 4 years in the East Side house, the warped step, the window that didn't close, the back pew, and the sound of other people finding every other seat in the room. She thought about Cole, in this kitchen, saying, "He knew what you were capable of. That's why he had to neutralize you first." She got up from the table. She folded the letter once more, and she put it in the pocket of her apron, not because she planned to do anything with it, but because she thought Cole should see it. Not because she needed him to respond to it or protect her from it, but because she had decided weeks ago that she was done managing information carefully to protect herself from things that might hurt. If this place was going to be real, and she was beginning, cautiously, carefully, aware of every risk, to think it might be, then it had to be built on what was actually true. She went back to making bread. She pressed the dough with the heels of her hands, and she worked it methodically, the way she'd worked everything in the past 4 years. without sentiment, without illusion, one task following another. And she did not let herself think about whether the offer in that letter represented a kind of safety, because she had been inside that kind of safety before, and she knew the difference between shelter and a cage. When Cole came in from the barn at midday, she set the bread to cool, poured him coffee, and put the folded letter on the table in front of him without preface. He looked at it, then at her. "Read it," she said. He read it. When he was done, he folded it back exactly as she had folded it and set it on the table and was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at him. This man who asked her what she wanted to do, rather than telling her what he thought she should. "Nothing," she said. "I want to do nothing with it." "All right. But I wanted you to know it exists." He looked at her steadily. "Why?" She thought about how to say it honestly without saying more than she was ready to say. "Because you've been straight with me," she said finally. "About everything. About Pierce, about the exchange, about what you're trying to build here and what it costs. I don't want to hold things back from you and then have you find out later that I was." Cole was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was doing something serious against the north wall. "Did you think about it?" he said. "The offer?" "Yes," she said. Because she had. For about 4 minutes she had thought about it, the version where this was easier, where she went back to something familiar, where she was protected by the same man who had built the cage in the first place. "And? I'd rather fix a roof that I own than live under one I'm only borrowing," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression was very quiet and very careful, the way a man looks when he is working to make sure he is understanding something correctly before he responds. "You know you have a place here," he said. "Whatever happens with Pierce, whatever the valley decides, that's not conditional." She heard it. She received it. She did not perform gratitude or deflect it or qualify it into something smaller and safer. "I know," she said. The bread was cooling on the counter, and outside the wind was serious, and in the kitchen of the Brennan ranch 2 people sat across from each other with something between them that had no name yet, that was too new and too fragile and too important to name before it was ready, and neither of them reached for it or pushed it away. They just let it be what it was. The letter sat in Cole's coat pocket for 3 days before he did anything with it. Not because he didn't know what he wanted to do, he knew almost immediately. But knowing what you want to do and knowing the right time to do it are 2 different kinds of knowledge, and Cole had learned the hard way, in a different county, a different operation, a different set of mistakes, that acting on the first kind before you had the second kind usually made things worse. So he waited. He watched. He kept working. The ranch was entering the phase of winter that separated the operations that had prepared from the ones that hadn't. The Carlisle feed arrangement had come through, which meant the cattle were covered and the hands had what they needed, and Cole didn't owe Pierce or the exchange a single favor in exchange for it. That had cost him more than the local arrangement would have, and he was clear-eyed about it. He wasn't operating at a loss, but his margin was thinner than he'd wanted for the first winter in a new place. He didn't mention this to Vivian, not because he was managing her, but because it wasn't yet a problem, and he had learned that bringing people into worries before the worries required company just multiplied the weight without dividing it. She found out anyway. She found out because she was the one managing the household accounts, which meant she could see where the money was going, and she was precise enough with numbers that she noticed the differential between what the Carlisle feed was costing and what the Valley arrangement would have run. She brought it up on a Thursday morning, not dramatically, just set the accounts book on the kitchen table in front of him with her finger on the relevant line. "That's about 18% more than the Valley rate," she said. He looked at the number. "Yes. Over the full winter, that's going to be significant." "I know." She sat down across from him. "I can cut the household expenses. Not by much. I'm already running lean, but there's some room in the supply ordering if I adjust a few things." He looked up at her. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," she said, with a precise echo of something he'd said to her weeks earlier that she had clearly kept. "I'm offering because it makes sense, and because this situation exists partly because of me." "It exists because of Pierce," he said. "Cole." She said his name with the particular patience of a woman who has decided to be direct and is not going to be redirected. "I know whose fault it is. I'm not talking about fault. I'm talking about math." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the number again. Show me where you'd cut, he said. She opened the accounts book to a page she'd already marked, which meant she'd been thinking about this before she brought it to him, which meant she'd done the work first and the asking second, which was, he was coming to understand, exactly how her mind operated. They went through it together for an hour, and when they were done, they had trimmed enough that the margin concern went from pressing to manageable, and Cole sat back and thought about the 4 years this woman had spent being told she had nothing to offer, and felt something cold and clean move through him that was not entirely unlike anger. "You've been doing this your whole life," he said, "making things work with less than they should need." She closed the accounts book. "It's a practical skill." "It is," he said. "Gideon Pierce never told you that." She was quiet for a moment. Gideon Pierce, she said carefully, was more interested in what a household looked like from the outside than in whether it was actually working. She paused. He noticed when things were wrong. He did not notice when I'd spent 3 days making sure they weren't. Cole filed that away with the other things he was filing away. The picture was getting clearer, and it wasn't a comfortable picture, but he preferred clear over comfortable. "I'm going to ride out to see Baines," he said. "The rancher you told me about. This week, if the weather holds." Vivian looked at him steadily. "Be careful how you start that conversation. I remember what you said. Lead with what Pierce did to me. And don't offer him anything yet," she added. "He'll be suspicious of anyone coming with an offer too soon. Just let him talk. He'll have 4 years of things he hasn't been able to say to anyone who was listening." Cole nodded. He understood that particular pressure, the weight of things unsaid to someone worth saying them to. He rode out to Baines on Friday. Edmund Baines was a compact, weathered man of about 45 who had the look of someone who'd been careful for so long that it had become involuntary. Careful the way a man who'd been near fire too many times gets careful around matches. He came out of his barn when Cole rode up, and he looked at him with flat, assessing eyes and said nothing at all by way of greeting. "Mr. Baines," Cole said. "My name's Cole Brennan. I bought the Mercer place." "I know who you are. Mind if I get down?" Baines considered this for a moment that lasted longer than it needed to. Then he stepped back slightly, which Cole took as permission. He tied his horse and came to stand a reasonable distance from Baines, not crowding, not performing friendliness. "Pierce turned away 3 of my cattle shipments last month on grading technicalities," Cole said. "All 3 met standard. His exchange contact wrote them up as underweight by amounts that would have required the cattle to lose 30 pounds each between my property line and the market gate." Something moved in Baines's face. Not sympathy, recognition. "What'd you do?" Baines said. "Rerouted through Carlisle, costs more." "Always does." "He tell you why he was doing it?" Baines asked. "Pierce, did he lay it out for you, or just—" "He laid it out," Cole said. "He wants the woman I've hired, my housekeeper. He wants me to terminate her employment and fall in line with how he runs the valley, and he's making the cost of not doing that very clear." Baines looked at him for a long moment. "The Ashcroft woman." "Vivian Ashcroft." "Yes." Baines looked out toward his north pasture, the way men look at land when they're thinking about something else but need somewhere to put their eyes. "He ruined her name after the marriage?" "Thoroughly," Cole said. "Yeah." Baines' mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite anything else. "That's his way. You either serve a purpose for him, or you're a loose end. She stopped serving a purpose, so." "How long did he work on you before you gave up the independent trading arrangement?" Baines looked at him sharply. "Who told you about that?" "Someone in the valley who pays attention," Cole said. He didn't name Vivian. He had decided on the ride over that he wasn't going to, not because he was hiding her involvement, but because Baines's trust was fragile, and bringing in a third party before that trust was established could complicate things. "I've been talking to people, trying to understand how he operates before he finishes operating on me." Baines was quiet for a moment. He looked at Cole with the expression of a man running calculations in his head, not about money, but about risk, about whether this was another version of the same trap. "Why would you tell me any of this?" Baines said. "You come out here, you tell me Pierce is coming after you for the same reasons he came after me. Why tell me that? What do you want?" "Right now?" Cole said. "Nothing. I came out to talk to a man who's been through it before me. That's all." Baines watched him for another moment. "Come inside," he said finally. "It's cold." They sat at Baines's kitchen table, A different kitchen, a lonelier one, the kind of kitchen that had stopped being organized because there was no longer anyone in it who cared about organization. And Baines talked for nearly 2 hours. He talked about the trading arrangement he'd tried to build 3 years ago. 4 ranchers, Eastern Valley, trying to set up a direct route to market that bypassed Pierce's exchange pricing structure. He talked about how Pierce had moved against it, methodically, one rancher at a time, applying pressure at the points where each of them was most exposed. One man's water rights were suddenly under legal question. Another found his property survey being contested. A third had a bank loan called in early in a way that was technically legal and practically devastating. By the time he got to me, Baines said, there were only 2 of us left, and the other fellow had a sick wife and couldn't afford the fight. So, he looked at his hands. I made the business decision. You sold the arrangement. I dissolved it. Nobody paid me anything. I just stopped. He said this with the particular flatness of a man who has gotten used to not showing how much something cost him. And Pierce never said a word about it, never acknowledged it. Just one day the pressure was on, and the next day it wasn't. Like a spigot. Cole sat with this for a moment. The other rancher, he said. The one who had the sick wife. Is he still operating? Calvin Pruitt, East Ridge, about 12 miles up. His wife passed 2 years ago. Baines looked at him. Why? Because if Pierce has done this 3 times that I know of, to you, to Hartley, to Pruitt, then there's a record, a pattern, and patterns are useful things if you know how to use them. Baines was very still. What are you thinking about doing? I'm not sure yet, Cole said honestly, but I know that men like Pierce depend on every person he's done this to believing they're alone. That what happened to them was particular to them, their bad luck, their poor judgment, their weakness. The moment 2 of those people are in the same room comparing notes, the story changes. Baines looked at him for a long time. You're not a man who spooks easy, he said. I spook fine, Cole said. I just don't let it make my decisions for me. Baines looked out the window. The afternoon light was going early the way it did in winter, the sky compressing toward dark by 4 o'clock. I'll talk to Pruitt, he said quietly. Don't hold me to anything more than that, but I'll talk to him. Cole rode back to the ranch in the cold, and he thought about Vivian saying he didn't notice when I'd spent 3 days making sure they weren't. And he thought about Baines's kitchen and the way it had stopped being organized, and he thought about all the things that got quietly dismantled when one man decided that someone else's existence was an inconvenience to him. He thought, not this time. December came in like it meant business. The first real snow hit on the 4th 8 inches overnight, and Cole and the hand spent 2 days digging out and checking livestock and reinforcing the barn's south wall against drifts. Dusty got his hand stepped on by a confused heifer and swore in a very creative way, and Vivian rapped it and told him it wasn't broken, just bruised, in the calm, practical tone of a woman who had dealt with worse injuries than a bruised hand without a doctor within 20 miles, which she had. Dusty looked at her bandaging work and said, You do this before? On a ranch, yes. Your ranch? She kept her eyes on the wrapping. My husband's ranch. Dusty was 18 and not always wise, but he had the instinct to leave certain questions alone, and he left that one alone. Well, he said instead, you're real good at it. Thank you, Dusty. He paused. You know, when you first came out here, Reuben said... He stopped. I know what Reuben said, she told him. Yeah. He looked at his hand. Well, he doesn't say it anymore. She tied off the bandage. I noticed. It was true that Reuben had gone quiet on the subject of Vivian somewhere around the 3rd week. Not converted exactly. Not the kind of man who went in for formal revision of his positions, but operating with the pragmatic acceptance of a person who had evaluated the evidence and updated accordingly. He ate the food and did not comment on it except once, when she'd made a beef stew on a particularly brutal evening, and he'd said, almost inaudibly, "That's good," and went back to eating, and Vivian had taken it for exactly what it was worth. Hank, who had been the most consistent from the beginning, said to her one evening when they were alone in the kitchen, "You know this place is different than it was." "I know," she said. "Cole knows it too," Hank said. He was not a man who arranged words into more than they needed to be. "I've worked for 4 different operations. Never worked for one where the main house felt like someone gave a damn about it." She looked at him. Is that your way of saying thank you? It's my way of saying what's true, he said. Same thing. She went back to washing up, and she let that sit with her because letting true things sit with you was something she'd had to relearn. She had gotten so practiced at deflecting or diminishing that receiving something plainly had become an exercise she had to make conscious effort at. The proposal came on a night when the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that makes the house creak. That sounds like she should have expected it. She didn't. That's the honest truth of it. Cole had been working late in the front room, going over the accounts, and a letter from Baines that had arrived 2 days earlier with news that Calvin Pruitt had agreed to talk and had, in fact, had a great deal to say. More than Baines had expected. A detailed account of Pierce's methods that included dates and names and dollar amounts. Cole had been quiet and focused since that letter arrived, the way he got when something had clarified for him, and he was working out the implications. Vivian had banked the kitchen fire and was passing through to her room when he looked up from the table. Vivian. She stopped. He only used her first name when something was not a professional matter, which had become a signal she'd learned to register. I want to talk to you about something, he said. Sit down if you're willing. She sat. The room was warm from the fire and cold from the windows, the kind of differential that made you aware of both. He set the letter from Baines aside. He looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated attention she had come to recognize as entirely genuine. Cole Brennan did not look at people while thinking about something else. This operation is going to be in a fight come spring, he said. I think you know that. What Baines and Pruitt are describing gives me something to work with, a legal basis, potentially, for challenging Pierce's exchange practices. But that's a long road and an expensive one, and it'll get ugly before it gets clean. I know, she said. And you're at the center of why it started, he said. Not because you did anything wrong, because Pierce decided you were worth using. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind did something particularly direct against the north wall. I'm going to say something, he said, and I want you to hear it without deciding what it means before I finish saying it. She felt the particular careful attention of someone who knows they are about to receive something significant. I would like you to marry me, he said. The room went very still. Not for drama. Just because that was what happened in her body when she heard it. Everything went still the way things go still when a word lands that you weren't braced for. Cole, let me finish, he said. Not sharply, just firmly. I'm not asking because I feel sorry for you. I'm not asking because it solves a practical problem, though it would. I'm not asking because of what the town thinks or doesn't think. I'm asking because I have spent 3 months working alongside you, and I have not once, wanted to be somewhere else. I don't want a housekeeper. I want a partner. And the honest truth is that you already are one. I'm just asking if you want the official arrangement to match the actual one. She looked at him, this man who said things plainly and meant them plainly and didn't perform the saying of them. You know what people will say, she said. I know exactly what people will say, he said. I don't care what people say. You said that before. When you sat beside me in the pew, you said the town can do whatever it needs to do. She looked at him steadily. But that was before you knew how determined Pierce was, before you knew what it was actually going to cost you. And I still don't care. Cole, if you marry me, Pierce is going to treat this as a declaration. It'll stop being about business. It'll be personal. It's already personal, he said. It was personal from the minute I sat down beside you, and he decided it was his business to tell me what to think about you. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the East Side house, the warped step, the careful management of smallness, the back pew and the empty space around her that had been, for 4 years, the most accurate map she had of her position in the world. She thought about sitting at this kitchen table going through the accounts together, about the conversation in the barn with Tom Garrett, and the way Cole had not flinched, about Baines's kitchen, organized by no one, cared for by no one, and the way she had felt something cold and clarifying looking at it, some recognition of what she did not want her life to become. She thought about the letter from Gideon and the way she had put it on the table in front of Cole without rehearsing what she was going to say, because she had decided she was done managing information to keep herself safe. She thought, he knows what you cost him. He's asking anyway. I have to say something, she said, and I need you to hear it without deciding what it means before I finish. Something shifted in his expression, very slightly. Gideon told me I was barren, she said. You know that. The whole valley knows that. What the valley doesn't know is that I never had it confirmed. There was never a doctor who examined me and told me that. There was just Gideon's word. She held his gaze. I don't know if he was right. I don't know if we'd have children. I can't promise you anything about that. Cole looked at her steadily. I didn't ask you about children. You didn't, but you should have the honest answer to the question you didn't ask. All right, he said. I have it. Now I'll give you the honest answer to the question you didn't ask me. I'm not marrying you for a family. I'm marrying you because you're the person I want in this house, at this table, working alongside me on this operation, for the rest of what I can see of my life. He paused. Children would be a gift. You're not a consolation prize if there aren't any. Vivian looked at the table. She pressed her palms flat against the wood. This was a habit she had when she was trying to stay in her body rather than retreat into her head, which was where she went when things got large and she wasn't sure she could hold them. I don't know how to do this, she said quietly. A marriage where someone actually… She stopped. Where someone actually what? He said gently. Where someone actually sees me, she said, as a person, not as a useful arrangement or a symbol or a problem to be managed. She looked up at him. I know how to do the other kind. I did it for 3 years. I'm very good at performing a marriage. I don't know if I know how to actually be in one. Neither do I, Cole said. I've never been married before. I'll make mistakes. You'll make mistakes. We'll figure it out. She looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. He was quiet, like he was making sure he'd heard correctly. Yes, she said again, more firmly. I'll marry you. The room was the same room. The fire was the same fire. Nothing visually changed, but something had settled, like a long-held breath finally released. Cole put his hand on the table, palm up. Not reaching, not grabbing, just offering. She put her hand in his. His hand was warm and calloused and real, and she held it for a moment, and she did not cry because she was not quite that kind of woman. But she felt the thing that people cry at, the sudden weight of something you've wanted for longer than you let yourself know, finally being real enough to hold. I'll ride into town tomorrow, he said. Talk to Reverend… He stopped. Is there a justice of the peace? Judge Tolliver in Karsten, the next town over, she said. He handles marriages. Good, Cole said. I'd rather not give the town more performance than necessary. She almost smiled. That's practical of you. I'm a practical man. I know, she said. And she did know. That's, she thought, a significant part of why she'd said yes. They married on a Tuesday in mid-December. Hank drove them to Karsten in the wagon. He wore his best coat and said very little, which was his version of ceremony. Dusty had wanted to come and had been gently redirected by Hank, who understood that some things didn't need an audience of 5. Abe had pressed Vivian's good dress that morning, the green one, without being asked. She'd found it hanging outside her door when she got up, and she'd stood there looking at it for a moment before she took it in. She wore it to Karsten. Judge Tolliver was a short, neat man in his 60s with the businesslike manner of someone who had officiated a great many marriages and understood that the legal substance and the emotional substance were 2 different events happening simultaneously. He administered the legal substance efficiently. The other kind they managed on their own. Cole said his part looking at her directly, not at the judge. She said hers looking at him. Afterward, Hank drove them back to the ranch. The sky was the deep, flat gray of winter with something white building behind it, and by the time they reached the valley, the first flakes were falling. Not a storm yet, just a suggestion of one, the kind of snow that fell thoughtfully. They ate supper that evening around the kitchen table with all 4 hands, and Vivian had made the good meal she'd been planning for 2 days. Not fancy, but the kind of solid, generous cooking that meant she'd put care into every part of it. And Reuben, who was not a sentimental man and had never pretended to be, raised his coffee cup and said, "Well, congratulations," and drank, and went back to eating. It was, Cole said quietly to her later, the nicest thing Reuben had probably said about anything in years. Harlan Crossing found out about the marriage on Wednesday morning when Margaret Holt saw Cole at the supply store and addressed him as Mr. Brennan, and he said with easy plainness, Mrs. Brennan and I will need to double the flour order this week. Margaret went home. By noon, the town knew. By afternoon, two camps had formed with the efficiency of people who had been waiting for something to have an opinion about. The first camp was small but vocal. A handful of people who felt the marriage confirmed the worst of what they'd been saying. That Vivian Ashcroft had been working her way toward exactly this and that. A decent man had been maneuvered into a bad situation by a woman who knew how to make herself useful. The second camp was harder to characterize. It wasn't exactly supportive. These were people who had been repeating the same story about Vivian for 4 years, and stories of that age don't evaporate in an afternoon. But there was something in it that resembled discomfort, a quiet, private kind of discomfort that comes when the evidence starts not quite fitting the story you've been telling. Vivian knew about both camps. She knew because she went into town on Thursday for supplies, as she always had, and she felt the atmosphere the way you feel a room's temperature. Not any individual thing said to her, but the aggregate weight of awareness, of recalibration happening at a speed the valley wasn't comfortable with. Dorothy Garvey, behind her counter, looked at her for a long moment and said, with something that was not warmth exactly, but was less than what it had been before, Mrs. Brennan. It was the first time in 4 years anyone in a shop in Harlan Crossing had called her anything except the Ashcroft widow. Vivian looked at her calmly. Mrs. Garvey, she said. She bought what she needed and left. Gideon Pierce's response came not through a letter this time, but through action, and it came faster than Cole had expected. On the Friday of that week, 2 of the Eastern Valley ranchers who had been quietly talking to Baines and Pruitt received formal notices from the exchange revoking their provisional trading agreements, not for any stated cause, just a procedural removal during a board review, which was the kind of thing that was technically within the exchange's rights and practically indistinguishable from punishment. Cole got word on Saturday morning from Baines, who wrote out himself rather than sending a letter, which meant he considered it urgent enough for the effort. He found Cole in the barn, where Cole had been working on tack with the focused quiet of a man who was doing physical work because his mind needed the other kind. He knows we're talking, Baines said without preamble. I figured he would, Cole said. He kept working. Who told him? Don't know yet. Could have been anyone. Could have been someone who just noticed I'd ridden out your way a few times. Baines sat down on a hay bale, the same one Tom Garrett had sat on in what felt like a different era. Cole. He moved on 2 operations in 1 day. That's not him being annoyed. That's him deciding to end this. Cole set down the tack. He looked at Baines steadily. Are those 2 men going to hold? Pruitt will. He's got nothing left to lose and he knows it, and that makes him a different kind of person than he was 3 years ago. Baines paused. Kramer, the other one. I'm less sure. He's got a young family. Pierce knows that. What do you need from me? Baines looked at him. I need to know you're not going to fold when it gets heavier, because it's going to get heavier. And I'm not willing to go through another round of watching something get built and then disassembled by one man who thinks he owns the valley. Cole was quiet for a moment. He thought about Vivian saying, I don't know how to actually be in one. A marriage where someone actually sees me. He thought about the green dress on the hook outside her door, pressed by a man who had no reason to do it, except that it mattered. He thought about the kitchen and the accounts book, and the way she'd put Gideon's letter on the table in front of him without staging it. He thought about 4 years of a woman being told she was less than she was by a man who needed her to be less so he could be more. I'm not folding, Cole said. Baines looked at him for a moment longer. Then he nodded, once, the way people nod when they've decided something. All right, he said. Then we need to talk about a lawyer. Cole called for Vivian. She came into the barn with the directness she brought to everything. No wasted motion, no performance of arriving, and she looked at Baines and at Cole and assessed the room in about 2 seconds. What happened? She said. Cole told her. She listened without interrupting, which was her way. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, There's a man named Whitmore. He practices in Karsten, same town where we married. He handled a land dispute 2 years ago against an exchange member and won. I don't know him personally, but I know the woman who hired him, and she told me he was the kind of lawyer who wasn't interested in the comfortable interpretation of the law. Can you reach her? Cole said. The woman you know? I can write to her today, Vivian said. I'll have an answer by midweek if she responds promptly. Baines was looking at her with the expression of a man who has just recalibrated something. You knew about Whitmore before any of this happened, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just observation. I've been paying attention to this valley for 7 years, she said, with a composure that had nothing defensive in it. I didn't know what I'd use it for. I just knew that knowing things was better than not knowing them. Baines looked at Cole. Your wife, he said, with something in his voice that might have been respect and might have been something that didn't have a name. I know, Cole said. Vivian looked at both of them. I'll write the letter. You two figure out what documentation you have. I want to know every interaction with Pierce that was witnessed by a third party. Every letter, every meeting with Tom Garrett or Coates or anyone else he sent. Every exchange action that can be tied to a specific timeline. She looked at Cole directly. If we're going to do this, we do it with everything we have. We're going to do it, Cole said. She nodded once. She went back to the house. Baines watched her go, then he said to Cole quietly, She's been building toward this for a while, hasn't she? Cole picked up the tack again. She's been surviving it for a while, he said. There's a difference. But yes, I think she's been waiting for the moment when surviving it could turn into doing something about it. Outside, the snow had started again, coming down in the gray-white silence of deep winter, and inside the barn 2 men sat with the work in front of them and the weight of what was coming, and in the house a woman was already at the table writing a letter in her clear, careful hand. Not because anyone had told her to, but because she had finally, for the first time in 4 years, found herself on the right side of a fight worth fighting. The letter to Whitmore's contact went out on Saturday and came back by Wednesday, which was faster than Vivian had expected, and meant the woman on the other end had understood the urgency without being told to. Her name was Clara Reeves, a rancher's widow who had won a grazing rights dispute against an exchange member 2 years prior, and her letter was 3 pages of precise, unsentimental information. Whitmore was thorough. Whitmore was expensive. Whitmore had a particular dislike for operations that used institutional leverage to crush smaller parties, which meant he was motivated beyond his fee in cases like this, which also meant he pushed harder than strictly necessary sometimes, and you needed to be prepared for that. He was not a comfortable man to work with. He was, Clara wrote in her plain hand, the right man for this kind of fight. Vivian read the letter twice, then handed it to Cole. He read it standing in the kitchen, still in his coat from the morning barn work. When he finished, he looked up and said, Set up a meeting. I'll write today, she said. What do we bring him? Everything. She had already been thinking about this. Your records of the exchange interactions, the cattle shipment rejections with dates, Baines's account of the trading arrangement dissolution, Pruitt's account, any correspondence you have with Tom Garrett or Coates that shows a pattern. She paused. And I'll write out my own account, what Pierce did during and after the marriage, the specific things, with dates where I have them. Cole looked at her. You'd put that in writing? If it helps the case, yes, she said. It'll become part of a legal record. People will read it. People have been reading a version of my life for 4 years, she said. At least this one will be true. He looked at her for a moment longer with the expression she'd come to recognize as him checking whether she was certain rather than doubting her. She met it steadily, and he nodded and went back to the barn, and she sat down at the table and began to write. It took most of the day. She did not write it dramatically. She wrote it the way she organized accounts, in order, specifically with dates where she had them, and approximations clearly marked as approximations. She wrote about the first year of the marriage and the pressure she had felt, shapeless at first, then increasingly specific, to make herself smaller and quieter and more useful in the ways Gideon wanted, and less present in the ways he didn't. She wrote about the second year, when the question of children began to be raised, first gently, then with the particular edge of a man who was beginning to decide that the situation was someone's fault, and settling on the most convenient candidate. She wrote about the physician visit that hadn't been a physician visit. Gideon had told her she was going to see a doctor, and she had sat in an office while a man who turned out to be a friend of Gideon's asked her a series of questions and wrote things in a notebook and never once examined her physically. And she had been too young and too trusting and too conditioned to question what she was being told to push back. She wrote, I did not know until much later that this was not a medical examination. I believed, because I was told to believe, that a professional had assessed my situation. I understand now that I was told what Gideon Pierce had already decided was true, and that the appearance of professional confirmation was arranged to make the telling more credible. She stopped and looked at that paragraph for a long time. Then she kept writing. By the time she finished, it was dark outside, and the kitchen had gone cold because she'd forgotten to tend the fire. She got up and added wood and stood by the stove with her hands out to the warmth, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was tired. Not the tired of physical work. The other kind. The tired that comes from carrying something for a very long time and then finally setting it down, which should feel like relief, and instead feels, at first, like all the weight you were carrying has suddenly moved to your legs. Cole came in from the evening check and found her standing there. He looked at the pages on the table and at her face, and he didn't say anything for a moment. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. He poured her coffee, which she hadn't asked for, and set it near her on the counter, and then he read what she'd written while she stood by the stove with both hands around the cup. He read carefully, the way he did everything. He didn't rush, and he didn't perform reaction. When he was done, he stacked the pages neatly and said, "This is going to matter." "I know," she said. "It's not easy to read." It wasn't easy to write. She looked at her coffee. "But it's accurate. Every word of it." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry you had to write it." "I'm not," she said, which surprised her as she was saying it, but she found it was true. "I've been carrying it in my head for 4 years. Writing it down made it something outside of me. A document. Evidence." She looked up at him. "It's not my shame to carry. I just hadn't found the right place to put it yet." Cole looked at her with an expression that had too many things in it to be one thing. "No," he said quietly. "It's not your shame." The meeting with Whitmore happened in Karsten on the second Friday of January. He was nothing like Vivian had pictured. She'd imagined someone imposing, given Clara Reeves's description of his intensity. A large man, perhaps, with the bearing of someone accustomed to courtrooms. What she got was a man of average height in his early 50s with ink-stained fingers and a way of listening that made you feel like every word you said was being weighed and sorted in real time, which was, she decided, more useful than imposing. He read through everything they'd brought, her written account, Cole's records, Baines's and Pruitt's documented accounts, with the same focused silence, occasionally making a small mark in the margin of his own notepad. When he finished, he set the papers down and said, "The individual pieces are suggestive. Together, there's something more." "Enough to bring a case?" Cole asked. "Potentially, the exchange's removal of the 2 Eastern Valley members without stated cause creates an actionable record if I can establish it as part of a pattern rather than independent decisions. The cattle shipment rejections, your records are good on those, specific dates and weights. Support the pattern argument." He tapped Vivian's account. "This is the most legally complex piece. It doesn't directly involve the exchange's commercial practices. What it does is establish the character of the conduct and give context to why the commercial pressure exists." "Meaning it shows Pierce does this," Vivian said. "Meaning it shows this isn't his first application of organized pressure against someone who crossed him," Whitmore said. "It shows method. Judges and juries respond to method. It tells them this isn't a dispute between 2 businessmen who disagree. It tells them who Pierce is when he thinks no one is watching." Vivian sat with that for a moment. "What's the risk?" Cole asked. "The risk," Whitmore said, without softening it, "is that Pierce has more resources than you do, and he will use them. He'll engage his own legal representation, likely Hardcastle out of the city, who is excellent and expensive and comfortable with delay as a strategy. A delay strategy means he runs up your costs until you run out of fighting capacity. That's not a threat. That's a description of how this will probably go." "How do we counter that?" Baines said. He'd come with them, sitting at the end of Whitmore's table with his arms folded and the look of a man who'd heard bad news before and was practicing not flinching. "You build the coalition," Whitmore said. "Every rancher Pierce has moved against who can provide documented evidence becomes a party to this. The more parties, the more the cost is distributed and the stronger the pattern argument. One man claiming Pierce abused his exchange position is a dispute. 4 men with dates and letters and dollar amounts is a case." "We have 3, Cole said. "Potentially 4 if Kramer holds." "I need Kramer to hold," Whitmore said plainly. "If he folds mid-case under Pierce's pressure, it damages the whole structure. You need to know that going in." Cole looked at Baines. Baines looked at the table. "I'll write out to Kramer this week," Baines said. "Talk to him straight." Whitmore looked at Vivian. Your account. I want you to understand what it means if this goes to a public hearing. A judge will hear it. If Pierce contests the characterization, he may argue the medical question. He may bring testimony. What kind of testimony? She said. He could call the man who conducted whatever he called an examination, Whitmore said carefully. Try to establish it as legitimate. Vivian looked at him steadily. Can that man be compelled to testify about the examination itself? What he was asked to do and by whom? Whitmore was quiet for a moment. That's a good question. If he was asked by Gideon Pierce to produce a conclusion rather than to conduct an actual examination, she said, and if Pierce paid him for it, and if that payment can be documented, then the examination isn't medical evidence. It's testimony purchased by the man using it. Whitmore looked at her with the full attention he'd been applying to the documents. You've thought about this, he said. I've thought about very little else for 4 years, she said evenly. I just didn't have anyone to think about it with until now. Whitmore leaned back in his chair. He looked at Cole. Your wife, he said, not unlike the way Baines had said it in the barn, is going to be an asset in this case. I'm aware of that, Cole said. I'm sitting right here, Vivian said. Yes, Whitmore said with something that might have been a smile. I know. They drove back to Harlan Crossing in the wagon as the afternoon light went flat and gray across the valley. Baines had gone his own direction. It was just Cole and Vivian and Hank, who drove them with the comfortable silence of a man who understood that some conversations needed space around them. Are you all right? Cole asked her. He said it quietly, under the sound of the horses and the wagon wheels. Yes, she said. Then, more honestly, I don't know. I keep thinking about that man, the one Pierce hired to tell me I was Barren. I've spent 4 years angry at the word. I hadn't thought as clearly about the mechanism. The mechanism being that Pierce manufactured the evidence. Yes. She looked out at the valley passing on either side. Which means there was never any evidence. There was just a man with enough standing to make his word feel like fact, and a room full of people willing to let it. Including the town, Cole said. Including the town, she agreed. Including me for a while, I believed it too. She said this with the particular difficulty of something that took effort to say plainly. I believed I was what he said I was. For the first year after the marriage ended, I thought there was something genuinely wrong with me, and the question was how to live with it. And now? She looked at him. Now I think there might be something wrong with me, or there might not be, and either way it was never Gideon Pierce's to name. He didn't know. He never bothered to find out. He just needed an explanation, and I was the available one. Cole was quiet for a moment. When Whitmore mentioned the hearing, he said carefully, public. If it comes to that, are you ready for the whole valley to hear it? The whole valley already thinks they know it, she said. The difference is that what they'd hear at a hearing would be true. He nodded slowly. They rode the rest of the way in silence, and it was the comfortable kind. Not the silence of things unsaid, but of things said fully enough that they didn't need saying again. February moved through the valley with the grinding patience of a season that knows it holds all the leverage. The cold had settled into the kind of deep, permanent chill that stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like geography, just the condition of the place, something you worked around rather than waited out. The ranch had found its rhythm, not a smooth rhythm. Nothing about 5 people living and working in close quarters in a hard winter was smooth, but a functional one, which was better than smooth because it was real. Dusty had broken a fence post and fixed it himself without being told, which was the kind of thing Cole noticed. Reuben had taken over the water situation at the South Trough with a territorial investment that suggested he'd adopted it as his personal problem to solve, which was exactly the kind of ownership a good ranch hand needed and couldn't be manufactured artificially. Abe continued to exist in his quiet, competent way, and Vivian had long since stopped trying to figure out the full interior of a man who showed you everything he wanted to show you and nothing else. Hank told her one evening that Abe had been married once, years ago, and that the wife had died young, and that he'd been a man of 2 words for as long as Hank had known him, but he used to use more. She didn't ask Abe about it, but she understood after that why he'd been the first of the hands to treat her with simple, unremarkable respect from the start. Some people had learned through their own losses that the person everyone else was busy talking about was usually just a person. She was thinking about this on a morning in late February when she realized, for the first time with any certainty, that something had changed in her body. She didn't say anything for 2 weeks, not because she was afraid exactly, or not only because of that, more because she had learned not to build on uncertain ground. And the ground here was very uncertain. She knew enough about these things to know that certainty came later, if it came at all, and that the distance between possible and true could be considerable and costly. She did the arithmetic twice, then 3 times, in the private accounting of a woman who manages her own information before she manages anyone else's. The arithmetic kept coming out the same. She told Cole on a Thursday morning in early March, before the hands were up, in the kitchen with the coffee on and the pre-dawn dark still heavy against the windows. She said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not make it too large before we know more." He set down his cup. He looked at her with the full attention she'd learned to recognize. "I think I'm expecting a child," she said. "I'm not certain. I want to see a real doctor before I say I'm certain, but the signs are—" She stopped. "They're what they are." The kitchen was very quiet. Cole looked at her for a moment that she couldn't read. Then he said, "How are you feeling?" She stared at him. She had prepared for several possible responses, and this was not any of them. "Tired," she said, "and, I don't know, cautious. I keep waiting for it to be wrong." "Because of what Pierce told you?" "Yes." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, just the way he did things, plain and present. "When can you see the doctor?" "I'll ride to Karsten next week. There's a physician there I've heard is reputable." "I'll come with you." "You don't—" "I'll come with you," he said again. She looked at his hand over hers. She nodded. "Cole," she said quietly, "if it's true, and if it holds, you understand what that means. For Pierce's account of me." He looked at her steadily. "It means he lied," Cole said. "It means he lied and the whole valley believed him, and I carried it for 4 years," she said. Not with heat, just with the weight of a fact that hadn't finished settling yet. Every Sunday in that back pew, every empty seat next to me, every time someone looked at me the way they looked at me, it was based on a lie he told because it was convenient. Cole's jaw tightened, not at her, at the thing she was describing. "Yes," he said, "that's what it means." She looked at him. "Are you angry?" "I've been angry since November," he said. "This doesn't change what I'm going to do about it. It just—" He paused. "It adds something." "What?" "A reason I didn't need," he said, "but I'll take." She understood what he meant. He hadn't needed a pregnancy to be furious at Pierce's treatment of her. He hadn't needed vindication to defend what he knew was right. The pregnancy didn't change the wrong. It just made it harder to ignore, which wasn't something it had ever been possible to fully ignore anyway. She squeezed his hand once. "I'll know more after Karsten," she said. "We'll know more," he corrected. The doctor in Karsten was a woman, which Vivian had not known and which mattered more than she'd expected. Her name was Dr. Ames, Eleanor Ames, and she was somewhere in her 40s with the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had decided a long time ago that confidence was more useful than performance. She conducted a real examination. She asked real questions. She took real notes. Afterward, she sat across from Vivian in her office and said, "You're in early stages. I'd say 10 to 12 weeks, though we can refine that. The signs are clear and consistent." Vivian held this for a moment. "And there's nothing unusual? No indication of any structural problem," Dr. Ames said. "You appear to be in good health. There's no reason, based on what I'm seeing today, to anticipate complications." She paused. "You mentioned in your intake that you were told by a previous physician you were unable to conceive." "By someone called a physician," Vivian said carefully. "I've come to question the accuracy of that assessment." Dr. Ames looked at her with a directness that was professional rather than intrusive. "On what basis was the conclusion reached?" "I was told it was based on an examination. I now believe it was based on a conversation." A pause. "Then the previous assessment was not medically grounded?" "No," Vivian said. "I don't believe it was." Dr. Ames made a note, then she looked up. "Is that assessment part of a legal matter?" "It may become part of one." "Then you should have documentation from me stating what I found and what I didn't find. A properly conducted examination with current findings." She said this matter-of-factly, as one professional discussing a practical reality with another. If someone told you something about your body without examining it, and that statement caused you damage, You deserve a record that contradicts it with actual evidence." Vivian looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I would like that." Cole was waiting outside. He stood up when she came out, and he read her face before she said a word. 12 weeks, she said. "Confirmed. The doctor found no problems." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." In the particular way he said things that were not small, with the same tone as everything else, because that was how he honored things, by not performing them. "She's going to write a medical statement," Vivian said, "a formal one, stating her findings and the absence of any structural issue." He looked at her steadily. "For Whitmore." "Yes." They stood on the street in Karsten in the early March cold, and Vivian was working to hold everything calmly, the confirmed reality of the pregnancy, the practical implications for the case, the strange, vertiginous feeling of being told by an actual doctor that the things she'd been told about herself for 4 years was simply not supported by any evidence a real examination could find. "He just said it," she said quietly. "Gideon. He just said it, and everyone believed him." Cole put his hand on her back between her shoulders, the way you do when someone needs to feel that they're not standing alone without making a production of it. "They won't be able to say that anymore," he said. Word got out by the end of March. These things always did. A valley this size where people's lives were interleaved at every point. Supplies, grazing, water rights, Sunday meetings, the post, the dry goods counter, had no sealed compartments. Information moved through it like water through soil, finding every available path. The pregnancy got out through Dorothy Garvey, which was perhaps inevitable given that Dorothy ran the counter where every woman in the valley eventually bought something she needed when her body changed. Dorothy was not malicious. She was just constitutionally incapable of possessing information without its eventually escaping. What Dorothy said was, "I hear Mrs. Brennan is expecting." What the valley heard was the subtext, which hit people at different speeds depending on how long they'd been carrying the story about Vivian Ashcroft and what the story had cost them to believe. For some, the small vocal camp that had decided the marriage was a scheme and the woman was the architect. The pregnancy became new material. Convenient timing, they said, after all these years. For others, the discomfort that had been quietly building since December found a clearer shape, because the arithmetic was not complicated. If Vivian was capable of having a child, then what Gideon Pierce had said about her was wrong. And if what Pierce had said was wrong, then 4 years of empty seats next to a woman in a back pew had been built on nothing. People handled this in different ways. Margaret Holt handled it by going quiet in public and then very apparently thinking privately, which Vivian noticed because Margaret had never been quiet before. Whatever she was thinking, she kept it to herself for 2 weeks, and then she appeared at the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon. Vivian answered the door. Margaret stood on the porch in her good coat with an expression that was doing a great deal of work to stay composed. She was holding a small basket. "I brought preserves," Margaret said, "from last summer for—" She stopped. "For the baby." Vivian looked at her for a moment. At the basket, and at the woman holding it, and at the 4 years of careful silence that stood between them. "Thank you, Margaret," she said. "Come in." Margaret came in. She sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee, and did not say what she had come to say for a full 5 minutes, during which Vivian made no effort to help her say it, because some things needed to be arrived at without assistance. "I want to say," Margaret said finally, looking at her coffee rather than at Vivian, "that I passed along what Gideon Pierce said about you because I believed it was true. I'm not—" She stopped. "I'm not saying that excuses it. I'm saying I believed it. And if I had known that I didn't actually know whether it was true or not, I would like to think I would have—" She stopped again. "I don't actually know what I would have done," she said, with the honesty of a woman who had been interrogating herself for 2 weeks, "because I accepted a man's word about his wife, without asking whether he had any basis for saying it. And the woman is sitting here, and she's been sitting in that pew for 4 years, and I—" She pressed her lips together. "I should have sat beside you." Vivian looked at her. The years of it were there, all of it was there in the space between 2 women at a kitchen table, the weight of all the Sunday mornings, and all the passed-along words, and all the empty seats carefully chosen to be somewhere other than next to her. She could have said many things. "You're here now," she said instead. Margaret looked up at her. "That's—" Margaret's voice had something uncertain in it, as though she'd prepared for more resistance and didn't know what to do with its absence. "I don't know that I deserve that." "I'm not offering it because you deserve it," Vivian said plainly. "I'm offering it because I'm tired of carrying the weight of Gideon Pierce's lie and everyone who believed it, and the only way to put it down is to stop making it the thing I measure every interaction by." She looked at her steadily. "You can sit beside me on Sunday. That's what I'm saying." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. It was not a resolution. It was not a clean ending. Margaret Holt had passed along a lie for 4 years, and a basket of preserves did not balance that account. Vivian knew that, and Margaret knew that, and neither of them pretended otherwise. But something had shifted. Something real and imperfect, and entirely unlike the smooth reconciliation that this situation could have been written into by someone who preferred their stories tidy chop. The public hearing was set for the 3rd week of April. Whitmore had moved faster than Vivian had expected, which meant Pierce's legal team had accepted the hearing schedule rather than delaying, which meant, Whitmore told Cole when he rode out to brief them, that Pierce thought he could win a public hearing more easily than a protracted legal fight. He was betting on his standing in the valley. "That's a mistake," Vivian said when Cole relayed this. "Why?" he asked. "Because he's been betting on his standing in this valley for 20 years and it's never cost him anything," she said. "He doesn't know how to account for the possibility that it might." What Pierce had not accounted for was Whitmore's coalition. 4 ranchers, Cole, Baines, Pruitt, and ultimately Kramer, who had held, barely, with considerable effort from Baines, sitting at the same table in a public hearing with dated records and documented accounts. And Vivian's written testimony, and Dr. Ames's medical statement, and one more thing that no one had expected. The man Pierce had sent to give Vivian her non-examination 7 years ago had died 2 years after he'd done it, which meant he couldn't testify. But the man had a ledger, medical records, and private notes that his widow had kept in a box and never opened because there was nothing in it she particularly wanted to read. Whitmore had tracked the widow down through the kind of careful investigation that justified his fees. He had asked, gently, whether the ledger might be available for review. The widow, who had her own opinions about her late husband's activities, had handed it over without significant argument. The ledger contained, among other things, an entry from the date of Vivian's examination. It was 3 lines long. It said Pierce referral, no examination conducted, client confirms wife unable to conceive. Note, paid separately, not through practice account. 3 lines. Whitmore read them to Cole and Vivian in his office, and the room went very quiet. "He paid him separately," Vivian said. "Off the books," Whitmore confirmed. "Which means Pierce knew it wasn't a real examination. He paid for a conclusion, not a consultation." Vivian looked at the pages. She had known this, in the way you know things you can't prove. She had known it as a feeling, a shape of wrongness that had no documentation attached to it, that she'd carried without being able to set it down. And now it was 3 lines in a dead man's handwriting in a ledger that had been sitting in a box for 2 years. "He knew," she said, "from the beginning. He never believed it himself. He just needed someone else to say it." "Yes," Whitmore said. Cole was looking at the ledger entry with an expression that was very controlled and very cold. "Can this be used at the hearing?" Vivian asked. "It goes directly to Pierce's credibility," Whitmore said, "and to the character of his conduct. The commercial case against him rests on pattern. This establishes a pattern that predates any of the exchange actions. A man who manufactures medical evidence about his wife is a man who manufactures the evidence he needs. That matters when you're asking a judge to evaluate whether exchange decisions were legitimate or coercive." The hearing date came. The meeting hall in Harlan Crossing was full. Vivian had known it would be. A valley this size, with a dispute this visible, between Pierce, who had operated here for 20 years, and the coalition of ranchers who were accusing him of systematic commercial abuse, was not something people stayed home for. She sat in the front area, behind the table where Cole and the other ranchers sat with Whitmore, and she was aware of the room behind her in the way you're aware of weather, not looking at it directly but feeling its temperature and direction. Pierce sat across the table with Hardcastle beside him, and he looked, as he always looked, like a man entirely confident in his position. He looked at Cole without warmth or particular hostility. He looked at Baines and Pruitt and Kramer with the practiced indifference of a man demonstrating that he did not consider them serious. He did not look at Vivian at all, which told her more than looking would have. Judge Carraway was brought in from Karsten, neutral ground, and he was a brisk, careful man who made it clear from his first words that he would run the proceeding on the merits and not on the history of the Valley's social arrangements. Whitmore presented the case methodically. The cattle rejections with their documented inconsistencies. The exchange membership revocations without cause. Baines's account. Pruitt's account. Kramer's account. The timeline of pressure applied to each operation and the common thread connecting them to their relationships with Cole Brennan. Hardcastle pushed back on each piece. The rejections were within exchange grading authority. The membership revocations were procedurally proper. The rancher's accounts were self-interested. He was good. He was precise. He made each individual piece look like a reasonable business decision. Then Whitmore introduced Vivian's written account. The room changed temperature. Hardcastle objected to its relevance. Whitmore argued pattern and character, and Judge Carraway allowed it, and Whitmore read the relevant portions aloud in the same measured tone he used for everything. And the room was very quiet in the way rooms get when people are trying to process something that is changing the shape of what they thought they knew. Then Whitmore produced the ledger. He explained its provenance carefully, establishing the chain from the late physician through his widow through Whitmore's office. He read the 3 lines. The room went quieter than it had been before. Even Hardcastle was still for a moment. Pierce, across the table, showed nothing on his face. He was too experienced to show anything on his face in a room full of people, but his hands, which were folded on the table in front of him, tightened. Vivian saw it. She was the only one at the right angle to see it, and she filed it away as the confirmation she had needed, that he had known, that he had always known, and that the 3 lines in the ledger were not a surprise to him. Then Whitmore introduced Dr. Ames's medical statement. He read it aloud, simply and fully. A proper examination, conducted in March of the current year, finding no structural abnormality, no physiological basis for an inability to conceive. Current pregnancy confirmed at 12 weeks and progressing normally. He let the silence after it sit for a moment. Then he said, to the room rather than to the judge specifically, "The woman this Valley was told could never have a child is currently expecting one. The medical record on which that assessment was based," he held up the ledger entry, "was not a medical record. It was a purchase note for a conclusion that was never actually reached by anyone who examined her," Hardcastle said. "Your Honor, this is inflammatory." "It's documented," Whitmore said. Judge Carraway looked at Pierce's table. Then he looked at Whitmore. "Continue," he said. Pierce did not testify. His legal team had advised against it, which was correct, because there was nothing he could have said that would have helped him. He sat at his table and he looked at the room with the controlled composure of a man who was watching something end and had not yet decided whether to pretend it wasn't. The Valley looked back at him. From the 3rd row, Vivian could see this when she turned slightly. Margaret Holt was sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her face doing the particular complicated work of a woman who has spent 4 years passing along a story and is sitting in the room where the story has just come apart in documented detail. Judge Carraway didn't rule that day. He said he would review the materials and issue his determination within 2 weeks. This was the proper procedure and everyone in the room understood it. But what the room felt, as people filed out into the April afternoon, was not uncertainty. It was the particular atmosphere of a community that has just watched the foundation of something shift and is beginning the process of deciding what to do about it. Vivian walked out beside Cole, and Baines fell into step on her other side, and Pruitt behind them, and they came out into the sunlight, and Vivian stopped for a moment and turned her face up into it the way you do when you've been inside a long time. Cole stood beside her and said nothing, because nothing was required. "The ledger," she said finally. "Yeah," he said. 3 lines, she said. 4 years, and it was 3 lines in a book in a box. "Sometimes that's how it is," he said. She looked at the valley around her, the spring green hills, the ranches dotted across the basin, the town of Harlan Crossing, with its back pew and its dry goods counter and its long, efficient memory. "It's going to take time," she said. "Even after the ruling, even after people know, it's going to take time." "I know," Cole said. "I'm not in a hurry," she said. She stopped, put her hand against her midsection, which had begun, barely, to show the shape of the change. I want her, or him, to grow up in a valley that knows who their mother actually is. Cole put his arm around her shoulders, right there on the main street of Harlan Crossing, with the whole town walking past. She didn't stiffen. She didn't look around to see who was watching. She just leaned into it, slightly, and stood there in the April sunlight and let herself be seen. Judge Carraway's ruling came on a Thursday, 14 days after the hearing, delivered by post to Whitmore's office in Carston, and then by Whitmore himself, who rode out to the Brennan ranch on a Friday morning with the papers in his coat and the particular manner of a man who had won and knew it and was not going to perform it. He sat at Vivian's kitchen table, the same table where two people had gone through accounts together, where a letter from Gideon had been laid down without ceremony, where a marriage had been agreed to in plain language on a cold night. And he set the ruling in front of Cole and said, "The exchange's removal of Baines, Pruitt, and Kramer has been voided. The cattle rejection records have been entered as evidence of coercive commercial practice. Pierce has been ordered to dissolve his personal involvement in exchange pricing decisions for a period of 3 years, with a neutral board appointed to oversee his remaining membership." Cole read through the ruling. His face was the same as it always was, focused, unrevealing. "He keeps his membership," Cole said. "Yes," Whitmore said. "He loses the control," which is what he actually used. The membership itself is the legitimate part of what he built. The abuse was in how he operated it. He paused. "This is the realistic outcome. He's not destroyed. He's curtailed." "And the ledger?" Vivian asked. She was standing at the stove, not because she had anything on it, but because she'd needed something to do with her hands when Whitmore arrived. "The physician's note, the purchase conclusion." The ruling specifically references it as evidence of a pattern of manufactured justification, Whitmore said. He looked at her directly. "It's in the legal record now, permanently. Anyone who wants to understand what was done to you has a document that explains it, in a judge's language, with his seal on it." She looked at the ruling in Cole's hands, the pages of it, the formal language that had taken 4 years of her life and turned it into something with a legal name and a documented mechanism. "Does it say," she asked carefully, "that the medical assessment was false?" "It says the physician's note was not the product of a legitimate examination and cannot be considered medical evidence of any condition," Whitmore said. "In legal terms, that's as direct as it gets." She nodded once. Cole set the ruling down and looked across the table at Whitmore. "What do we owe you?" Whitmore told him. It was significant. Cole didn't flinch. "I'll have it to you by end of month," Cole said. Whitmore nodded. He accepted the coffee Vivian put in front of him and drank it and talked through a few remaining procedural matters. And then he put his coat back on and went out to his horse, and Vivian stood in the doorway and watched him go and felt the strange, incomplete feeling of a conclusion that was real, but not yet fully real. Like a knot untied that the rope still held the shape of. Cole came to stand beside her. "It's over," he said. "Most of it," she said. "What's left?" She thought about it honestly. "The part that happened in people's heads," she said. "The ruling doesn't reach that. That's the part that changes slowly." "Or doesn't change," he said. "Or doesn't," she agreed. "But that's not the same as it not being over." He looked at her sidelong. "When did you get philosophical?" he said. "I've always been philosophical," she said. "You just haven't been listening long enough." Something in him relaxed. She could see it, a slight loosening around his eyes. The kind of thing you only saw on a person's face when you'd been watching it long enough to know what tension looked like on it. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold." "It's April," she said. "It's cold in April," he said. She came inside. Gideon Pierce did not leave the valley. She had half expected him to, in the weeks after the ruling, had imagined some version where the public weight of it became too much, and he relocated to a city where nobody knew the history. But Pierce was not a man who relocated. He was a man who recalibrated. She saw him at the dry goods store in early May, about 3 weeks after the ruling. She had not planned for this encounter. She came around the end of the counter, looking for salt, and he was standing at the opposite end, and they were suddenly in the same small space with no way to make it otherwise. He looked at her. She looked at him. He was the same, physically, the same jaw, the same way of standing, the same quality of presence that had once seemed like solidity and now seemed like a different thing entirely, some kind of careful performance of a man that had been maintained for so long, the performer had forgotten it was a performance. He looked, if she was honest about it, like someone who had recently sustained a significant loss and was working very hard not to let it show. Good, she thought. And then, surprising herself, not good, not satisfying, just finished. The way you feel when a long argument is finally done and you realize the argument was never the point and you've lost time that belonged to something else. Vivian, he said. Gideon, she said. He looked at her midsection, which was visibly changed now. She was 6 months along and it showed, and she let him look without moving or adjusting or accommodating his discomfort in any way. He stopped. She waited. Not cruelly, just because she was not going to fill the silence for him. I want you to know, he said finally, that I did not intend... He stopped again. Things became more complicated than I anticipated when I... Gideon, she said. He looked at her. Don't, she said quietly. Whatever you're about to say, the version where it was complicated, or where you didn't anticipate, or where something became something else, don't. She looked at him steadily. You paid a man to tell me I was broken so you could explain me away. I think we're past the version where there's a comfortable sentence that covers it. His jaw tightened. The ruling, he started. I'm not talking about the ruling, she said. The ruling is a legal document. I'm talking about the fact that you looked at me, a person you had promised to be honest with, and you decided your convenience was worth more than my actual life. She kept her voice even. Not because she didn't feel the anger. She did. She had felt it for years. It was simply a well-managed feeling at this point. You don't have to apologize to me. I don't need it. I just need you to understand that I know exactly what happened, and you know that I know. And that's the part that can't be taken back. Gideon Pierce looked at her for a long moment. Whatever she had expected, anger, defensiveness, the smooth redirect of a man who had been managing conversations his whole life. What she got was something more like a man looking at himself clearly for the first time in a long time and not enjoying what he saw. He didn't say anything. He picked up what he'd come to buy, and he went to the counter, and he left. Dorothy Garvey, who had witnessed all of this from behind her counter with the expression of a woman who was paying very close attention, said nothing until the door had closed behind him. Then she said, to Vivian, in a voice that was quieter than usual, He didn't argue with you. No, Vivian said. That's the first time I've ever seen Gideon Pierce not argue with something, Dorothy said. Vivian set her salt on the counter. He couldn't argue with it because it was true, she said. That's the only thing that ever actually stops people from arguing. Dorothy looked at her. Then she looked at the salt. Then she said, No charge for that today. It was not an apology. It was an impulse toward something that didn't have a clean name. Vivian understood that. Small towns ran on exactly this kind of gesture. The thing said sideways, the price not charged, the seat moved slightly over on a bench, none of them enough, and all of them something. Thank you, Dorothy, she said. She walked home in the May sunshine with her salt and her 6 months, and the particular lightness of a woman who has said the true thing to the right person at the right time and is not going to spend any more energy deciding whether it was enough. The baby was born in late July, on a Tuesday, in the way that births happen on ranches when the nearest doctor is 20 miles away, and you've been sensible enough to make arrangements well in advance. Dr. Ames came out from Karsten the week before, when it was clear the time was close, and she stayed in the extra room and ate Vivian's cooking and told Hank that she'd never eaten this well at a medical call before, which made Hank look quietly satisfied without technically smiling. The labor was long. Not dangerous, not particularly, not the kind of long that Dr. Ames went quiet over, just the ordinary, grueling, humbling duration of a body doing the hardest work it knows how to do. Vivian worked through it with the same focused stubbornness she'd brought to everything else, and Cole sat outside the door for most of it because Dr. Ames had told him firmly that there was nothing useful he could do inside and she needed room to work. He sat in the hallway for 7 hours. Dusty tried to talk to him around hour 3. Cole looked at him, and Dusty decided that he was fine without company and went back to the barn. Hank brought coffee, set it on the floor beside Cole, and left without a word. Cole drank it without tasting it. When the baby cried, that first sound, that specific impossible sound that people describe, and that no description actually reaches, Cole put both hands over his face and held them there for a moment. Dr. Ames opened the door. "Daughter," she said. "Mother and daughter, both fine." He went in. Vivian was exhausted in a way that went past what faces usually show, past the language of tired into something more fundamental, some deep-down wrung-out quality that was also running through it like a vein of something valuable, unmistakably alive. She was holding the baby with the slightly uncertain hands of a woman handling something she'd believed for 4 years she would never hold, and she was looking at it with an expression Cole had never seen on her face before, because it was an expression she had never had reason to have. He sat on the edge of the bed. She looked up at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "She's real," Vivian said. "Not philosophically, just confirming it. The way you confirm something when you don't fully trust your own evidence yet." "She's real," Cole said. Vivian looked down at the baby. "She has your nose." "She has everybody's nose at this stage," Cole said. "She has your nose," Vivian said firmly, and Cole did not argue. He put his hand very gently on the baby's head, his calloused, work-roughened hand against the impossibly fine dark hair, and he held it there, and he was quiet in the particular way of a person in the presence of something they did not know they were capable of wanting until they had it. "What do we call her?" he said. Vivian had been thinking about this for weeks without saying so, which was entirely in character. "May," she said. "Just May." "Not a family name?" "No," she said. "I don't want a name with history attached to it. I want a name that's just hers." Cole looked at the baby. "May Brennan," he said. "Yes," Vivian said. Outside in the hall there was the sound of boots, careful, attempting quiet, not quite achieving it, and Vivian said, "Someone should tell Hank." And Cole got up and opened the door and found Hank standing about 3 feet back from the door with his arms at his sides and the expression of a man who has been trying to be respectful of privacy and has been failing at it for the last 20 minutes. "Daughter?" Cole said. "Both fine." Hank nodded. He looked past Cole at Vivian and the baby for one moment, and something moved across his face that was brief and real, and that he did not perform at all. "Good," he said. Then he walked back down the hall, and Cole heard him call to Dusty in the yard in a voice that was not quite as flat as usual. Dusty's response, from somewhere near the barn, was immediate and loud and profane with joy. May was 3 months old the first Sunday Vivian brought her to meeting. She had gone back to Sunday meetings in May, 2 weeks after the ruling came out, and she had sat in the back pew, and Margaret Holt had sat beside her as she'd said she would. And that had been awkward in the way that things are when they're real rather than performed. Some stiffness, some silences that needed filling, some things that were said slightly wrong and neither of them pretended weren't. It was working. It was imperfect and real, and it was working. In August, she walked in with May in her arms and Cole at her side, and she went to the back pew and she sat down, and around her the room did what it always did. Adjusted, shifted, the acoustic quality of a space where something had changed. Margaret was already there. She scooted over to make room and looked at the baby with the expression of a woman who has been looking at babies for 40 years and will never entirely stop thinking they're remarkable. "Oh," Margaret said, quietly. "Yes," Vivian said. Margaret looked at her over the baby's head. "She's lovely, Vivian." Vivian looked at her daughter, the fine dark hair, the small closed fists, the expression of utter uninterested authority that very young babies have, as though the world is clearly going to be held to a standard. "She is," she said. The meeting started. May slept through most of it with the profound confidence of a creature who had decided she was safe. Cole turned pages at the right times. Margaret sat where she'd said she would sit. In the front of the room, life went on with its ordinary machinery. Afterward, on the steps, a woman named Ruth Acker, who had 3 grown sons and had lived in the valley for 30 years, and had never said a particular word to Vivian in any direction, stopped beside her and looked at May and said, "First?" "First," Vivian confirmed. Ruth nodded. "Hard work ahead," she said, with the cheerful practicality of a woman who had done it 3 times. "But you look like someone who doesn't mind hard work." She walked away. Vivian watched her go. It was not a grand gesture. It was not apology or restitution. It was a woman speaking to another woman at a Sunday meeting about a baby, the way women had been doing since the first Sunday meeting in the first small town. But it was directed at her without reservation, without the slight sideways quality that an interaction with Vivian Ashcroft had always had in Harlan Crossing, the faint awareness of the story that preceded the person. It was just direct. She told Cole about it later, in the wagon on the way home, with May in her arms and the August light coming long across the valley. He listened. Then he said, "Is that what you wanted? For people to just talk to you normally?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "I wanted to not be a story first and a person second," she said. "I think that's what I always wanted. Even when I was married to Gideon and I was a respectable story, still a story first. The beautiful wife, the good household. Even then I wasn't—" She stopped. "People knew the shape of me without knowing me." "And now?" he asked. She looked at the valley, the familiar hills, the familiar ranches, the road home. "Now some people are starting to see past the shape," she said. "Not everyone, not all at once, but some." She looked at May's sleeping face. "She'll grow up here. I want her to grow up in a place where people learn something, not just about me, about how easy it is to let one person's word become everyone's truth without asking a single question about it." Cole drove the horses in silence for a moment. "Do you think they did?" he said. "Learn something." "Some did," she said. "Some won't. That's the honest answer. But I've stopped expecting everyone to learn things in order to feel like the learning mattered." He glanced at her. "When did that change?" She considered. "When I stopped needing the town's accounting to match mine," she said. "I know what happened. You know what happened. The ruling says what happened. May is here, and she is what happens when you know the truth." She looked out at the road. "I spent 4 years trying to make the town's version of me match the real one. I don't need that anymore. What's true is true whether they get there or not." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "You know," he said, "when I sat down beside you in that pew, I didn't have a plan. I wasn't trying to make a statement." "I know," she said. "I just saw a woman sitting alone in a room full of empty seats next to her," he said, "and I thought, that's a strange kind of unkind, making yourself not be somewhere rather than just sitting down." "That's all it was?" she said. "You just thought it was strange." "And I wanted coffee," he said. "There was coffee at the meeting. I needed to sit somewhere to get the coffee." She looked at him. "Cole." "Both things were true," he said, and there was something at the edge of it that was his version of humor, the dry, understated kind that took her several months to fully recognize. She looked at him for a moment and then she laughed, actually laughed, the kind that wasn't performed or managed, that came up from somewhere honest. May stirred slightly at the sound of it, and Vivian shifted her gently, and the laughter settled, and what was left was better, warm and real, and particular to this wagon, this road, this life. The coalition that Cole and Baines and Pruitt and Kramer had formed did not dissolve after the ruling. It became something else. Slower moving and less urgent, but more durable. A set of trading arrangements and shared resources that operated outside the exchange's pricing structure. Not in opposition to it, but simply independently. Whitmore had been right that Pierce would retain his membership. He had also been right that losing the control was the thing that actually mattered. Pierce's influence in the valley did not vanish. Men who had built something over 20 years don't lose it in a month. But it had a different quality now, not the unchallenged authority of a man who has never been publicly contradicted, but the reduced standing of one who has been found to have manufactured his own evidence, and who operates in a valley where that is now part of the record. He moved his household operation west in the autumn, not out of the valley, but to the far western edge of it, which was far enough that his presence in Harlan Crossing became intermittent. Whether this was strategic or simply a man who had found his social air supply reduced, Vivian didn't know, and found she didn't need to. She thought about him sometimes, not with hatred. She had been through enough of that kind of sustained bitterness to know it cost more than it returned. She thought about him with the particular flat clarity of someone who had understood a thing fully enough to put it down. He was a man who had needed to diminish other people in order to feel secure in himself, and he had been very good at it, and it had worked for a very long time, and then it had stopped working, and that was the whole of it. The understanding didn't make what he did smaller, it just made it less mysterious. And things that were less mysterious were less powerful. May's first winter was a hard one, which was the valley's nature. You got one gentle winter for every two that reminded you where you were. But the ranch was prepared. The supply arrangements held. The Reformed Coalition meant that 3 operations shared resources during the worst of it, which made all 3 stronger than they would have been alone. Dusty turned 19 and started showing the kind of judgment that distinguished men who would be good at this work from men who had always been going to be good at it. He'd been one of the latter from the beginning. It was just arriving fully now. Cole took him on formally as a senior hand, and the change in Dusty's bearing was visible within a week. The kind of shift that comes when someone is seen for what they're already becoming. Reuben left in February. He came to Vivian directly to tell her, which she hadn't expected, and which told her something. "Heading to my brother's place in the Northern Territory," he said. "He needs a hand, and I've been here long enough." He looked at her with the expression of a man who has something to say that doesn't have clean words attached to it. "You run a good house." "Thank you, Reuben." He nodded once, then, "I was wrong about you, at the start." "I know," she said. "I'm saying so," he said. "I hear you," she said. He nodded again and left. And that was the whole of it. And it was exactly the right amount. Abe stayed. Vivian suspected, would stay for a long time. He had stopped being a man who was waiting to leave somewhere and had become a man who was in a place, which was a different condition entirely, and one that suited him better. Hank, asked once whether he had any plans beyond the Brennan Ranch, said, "No," with such immediate certainty that the question hadn't needed to be asked. Thus, May was 2 years old when she started walking with the aggressive confidence of a child who has decided that the world is hers to navigate and has no interest in anyone's assistance. She had Vivian's green eyes and Cole's bone structure and her own particular expression, a focused, assessing look that made grown adults slightly accountable without quite knowing why. She called Hank "Ha" for 6 months, and he answered to it without comment. And this was perhaps the clearest indication anyone had that Hank was a man of genuine depth underneath the economy. By the time May was 3, there was a second child, a boy, James, with dark hair like Cole's, and Vivian's careful way of looking at things. And the ranch house that had been quiet when Cole bought it had a sound to it now. The particular layered sound of a place where people lived fully. Not harmonious always. Not organized in the way Vivian's systems were organized, but genuinely alive. She had not expected this. She wanted to be honest about that because honesty mattered more to her than the smooth version. She had expected, at best, a manageable life, a functional arrangement, something better than the East Side house and the warped step and the careful small existence of a woman managing herself into invisibility. She had not expected this particular fullness. And she thought about that sometimes, about the cost of 4 years of believing you were less than you were. The way that kind of believing colonized your imagination so thoroughly that you stopped being able to picture the life that was actually available to you. She thought, the cruelest thing Gideon Pierce did was not the lie he told the town. It was the lie I started to tell myself. Because she had. She had looked at the empty seats around her and decided they were accurate, that they reflected something true about her worth, her capacity, what she deserved to have. She had gotten so good at managing smallness that she'd stopped seeing it as imposed. She'd begun to think it was chosen. And then a man had walked into the back of a room and asked if he could sit down. And the only thing he'd done, the only thing, was not believe the story the room had arranged itself around. That was it. That was all it had taken to start dismantling 4 years of careful diminishment. One person who looked at her and didn't see the story first. She thought about this on a Sunday in October, 3 years after that first Sunday, with May between her and Cole on the back pew, and James asleep against her shoulder, and Margaret Holt on her other side talking quietly to May about the hat on the woman 3 rows up, which May had decided was interesting. The back pew was full. It had been full for 2 years now. Full in the messy, practical way of family, rather than the neat way of a portrait. Someone's elbow in someone else's space. A small person demanding to look out the window. The constant, subtle negotiation of bodies arranged in close quarters. May looked up at her during a quiet moment and said, in the loud whisper of a 3-year-old who doesn't understand the concept of a whisper, "Why do we sit here?" Vivian looked at Cole. He looked at her. She looked back at her daughter, those green eyes, that focused, assessing gaze, already so much herself, and she said, "Because this is where your father first saw who I really was." May considered this with the seriousness she brought to information. "Not the other seats?" she said. Not the other seats, Vivian said. Why not the other seats? Because those were full of people looking at someone they thought they knew, Vivian said. And your father walked past all of them and sat down here. May looked at Cole. Did you know who she was? May asked him. No, Cole said honestly. Not yet, but I could see that everyone else was making a mistake. What was the mistake? Cole looked at Vivian with the look he had, the direct, unrevealing one that she had learned carried a great deal inside it. They were so busy believing something, he said, that they stopped looking. May thought about this. Then she turned back to the hat on the woman 3 rows up, because she was 3 and hats were more immediate. But Vivian held it, the answer, the simplicity of it, the fact that it was true and was the whole of what had happened. They were so busy believing something that they stopped looking. That was what fear did. What the hunger for the easy explanation did. What the authority of a confident man's word did, in a room full of people who found it simpler to accept the word than to ask the question. It didn't require malice. It didn't require a conspiracy. It just required a town of ordinary people who found it easier to not look than to see what was actually in front of them. And it required one person, one ordinary, coffee-wanting, hat-in-hand person, who walked past the arranged emptiness and sat down anyway. She thought, that's the thing about truth. It doesn't ask for courage in the dramatic sense. It just asks you to keep your eyes open. She thought, and to sit down. The meeting ended. The family moved out into the October sunlight. May running ahead immediately with the conviction of a person who has a destination. She hasn't identified yet. James still half asleep against Vivian's shoulder, Cole beside her with his hand briefly at her back. The valley spread out around them, green, gold, and wide. The same hills that had looked down on all of it. The back pew, and the letter, and the ledger, and the hearing, and the long winter, and the births, and the slow, patient work of a life putting itself back together. It was not a perfect valley. It was not a town that had fully reckoned with itself. There were people in Harlan Crossing who had not apologized and would not, who had recalibrated their behavior without examining their understanding, who treated Vivian Brennan with respect that was practical rather than genuine. She knew who they were. She did not pretend otherwise. But there were also, more of them every year it seemed, people who had let the experience sit inside them long enough to change something. People who had looked at what the collective uncritical acceptance of one man's word had done to one woman's life and had decided they were going to be the kind of people who asked the question next time, who were going to notice the empty seats before they found one themselves. That wasn't nothing. That was, in fact, the thing that mattered most. Not that justice had happened, not that Pierce had been curtailed, not even that she was standing here in the October light with 2 children and a man who had seen her clearly from the start. Those were the outcomes. What mattered was whether the people around them had learned anything about how they'd gotten to the outcomes, learned what it cost to let a story replace a person, what it cost the person, and what it cost the community that had agreed to look away. Some had. Some hadn't. That was the honest ledger of it. She looked at the valley and at her daughter running in the grass ahead of them and at the hills that would look the same in 50 years as they did now, and she thought, this is enough. Not because it's everything, but because it's real and it's mine and I am standing in it with my eyes open. Cole said from beside her, May's heading for the road. May's always heading for the road, Vivian said. Should we? Yes, she said. They went after her together, the way they did everything, not gracefully, not without the small negotiations of 2 people in close orbit, but with the genuine coordinated effort of people who had built something together and knew its weight and had decided it was worth carrying. May saw them coming and ran faster because she was 3 and that was what 3 did. And the back pew where a woman had once sat alone was somewhere behind them, full now, waiting for next